Chapter 120. Two Poison Fong members leaned against a fighter jet and talked to each other with guns in their hand. Another two fighter jets landed. The people inside walked out and joined the discussion. That son of a bitch throwing bombs everywhere still hasn't been found? Not yet. I've been scolded by the boss a few times today. I heard that Quofu and the others were killed. Quofu was De Bienzi's name. Yeah, they were ambushed by that son of a bitch Emao's. While they were chatting, one of them suddenly turned around and looked behind him. What's wrong? The person beside him asked. I feel like I'm being watched. TCH, you're scared by today's events, aren't you? Maybe, the man screamed. Something crawled into my body. Then, he let out a few more screams. He felt a sharp pain in his body. The three people beside him noticed a small bloody hole on his back. They were about to say something when they suddenly felt stabbing pain on their back and abdomen. When they looked closely, they found that they were all the same bloody holes. Fuck, what is it? It hurts like hell. The people nearby heard the noise and came over. Then, more and more people screamed in pain. Their arms, thighs, shoulders, necks, anything that was exposed had been crawled. Some of them had been greatly stimulated by De Bienzi and the others. Now that something like this was happening, they thought that the worms were about to crawl out of their bodies. They were so scared that they almost fell into despair. He was not afraid of death, but he did not want to see himself end up like De Bienzi and the others. He picked up a gun and pointed it at his own head. Bang! Blood sprayed all over the ground. Some people picked up a knife and stabbed at the bloody hole. They stabbed themselves until they were bloody, but they still could not find the thing that crawled into their bodies. Some people pulled the trigger and sprayed the surroundings under the stimulation of intense pain. They did not know where this so-called enemy was, but the sound of gunfire always made them feel a little safer. They did not have the time to care if other people were within their shooting range. They blindly fired aimlessly. Many people died to their comrades' guns in places where there were more people. Panic spread and chaos began to spread. Sillin watched the situation from a dark corner of a building. The corner of his mouth curled up slightly. They're here so soon? A gray shadow flashed by. Hui Mao jumped onto Sillin's shoulder. Hee, don't you know who's going to do it? After Sillin found out the location of the armory, he informed Hui Mao. Hui Mao went to intercept the armory, threw a bunch of grenades and swallowed some things. Wheeze, why do I feel like you've gotten heavier? Sillin looked at Hui Mao, who was licking his claws. Did I? I didn't feel anything, but I did eat a lot. Other than the energy-absorbing weapon you mentioned, I ate more than half of the things in the armory. Sillin's eyes twitched. How the hell did this guy eat? How are things in the Scarlet Sand region? Sillin asked. The little bugs are starting to come into play. The people guarding the armory don't even have time to care about their weapons. They're howling in pain from being bitten by the little bugs. How was it? I did a good job, right? SOSO. How can it only be SOSO? Hui Mao raised his claws and patted Sillin's face. I spread the eggs in more areas than you did, and I rescued the captives safely. Yes, Master Cat. You've worked hard. Did you leave any messages on the aircraft that Akai and the others were on? Hui Mao's claws paused as he patted Sillin's face. He then retracted them and curled himself into a ball, not saying a word. That was it. The situation at the time was like this. Since Akai and the others were still unconscious, and Wheeze couldn't wake them up, it picked them up one by one and loaded them onto the spaceplane. Then, it modified and perfected the spaceplane's navigation program that Sillin's spaceplane had copied into the spaceplane's autopilot program. After that, Wheeze watched the spaceplane fly into the distance while interfering with the other spaceplanes and fighters in the surroundings so that they couldn't lock onto Akai and the other's spaceplane. In reality, there were not many spaceplanes or fighters that launched an attack. This was because the spaceplanes were already too high up in the sky by the time they realized that the spaceplanes were not piloted by Poison Fong. By the time the other fighters reacted, Akai and the others had already flown out of the planet, and Carranio did not give the order to continue the pursuit. Akai and the others were brought onto the aircraft in an unconscious state, and Akai and the others probably did not know the flight path of the aircraft. If they woke up and messed around, they would probably get lost. Sillin had asked Huimao to leave a message for them not to mess around after they woke up, but Huimao had forgotten about it. All right, then we can only pray that Akai and the others don't wake up too soon. Sillin pulled at Huimao's exposed pointy ears. Let's sleep here for a bit. The hunt will begin in 5 hours. The place Sillin had chosen was temporarily free of danger. Even if there was danger, they would be alerted in time. Right now, Poison Fong was in chaos. Everyone's attention was focused on the bird of paradise, and people screaming could be heard everywhere. The people on the aircraft and fighters that were originally in the air did not dare return to the ground. It looked like the situation on the ground was even worse than before. Moreover, they had yet to develop the specialized medicine, so landing would only put them in a difficult situation. Wearing a protective suit, Carranio led a group of people into Poison Fong's research base. There were a lot of people working inside. Walking into a lab, Carranio saw a finger-sized insect through a transparent partition. Is that the thing that's causing such a ruckus here? Carranio pointed at an insect inside the lab. Yes. A researcher wearing a protective suit said with a crazed look in his eyes, "We've never seen this insect's genes before. We haven't even seen any species that are similar to it. Their genetic composition is a little special." The researchers here were only wearing normal lab coats before, but after 2 researchers had their bodies invaded by insects while they were researching them, causing them to become the experimental subjects of their colleagues, the researchers in the experimental base all wore thick protective suit. Since most of them stayed in the research base, more than half of them were not infected by the parasite. The bird of paradise that came later had not yet spread to this place. Listening to a string of technical jargon that he did not understand at all, Carranio raised a hand and strangled the researcher who was talking to himself. "This king is not here to listen to your long-winded nonsense." Just as the researcher's eyes rolled back and his neck was about to snap, Carranio finally let go and put the researcher down. "How's the specialized medicine coming along?" Cough, 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 cough. The researcher recovered and answered, "It'll take about 5 more hours to complete the preliminary analysis." Carranio let out a low growl. He was obviously very dissatisfied with this answer. "What can we do with these insects right now?" Not yet. They're very fast, say no more." Carranio cut him off and said to the people behind him, "If there's no progress in 5 hours, kill them." "Yes, my king." The researchers were afraid. This time, Carranio was for real. They had wanted to get more infected people to use as test subjects, but it looked like they had no choice but to give up for now. They had to hurry up. 5 hours was enough for a lot of things to happen. 5 hours later, the number of birds of paradise had grown to a terrifying number. They had also entered the logarithmic growth period that Sillin had originally calculated. When he opened his eyes, Sillin's eyes were cold. He flicked the ear of Huimao, who was curled up in his arms and sleeping soundly. "Wheeze, it's time to get up and hunt." Chapter 121. It hadn't even been 10 hours since Sillin had arrived on this planet, but the situation on this planet had completely changed in less than 10 hours. The Poison Fong members who were usually unwilling to even wear combat suits or anti-radiation jackets were now all wrapped up tightly and wearing the extra thick protective suits that were specially made for the occasion. They had to admit that Poison Fong did have a lot of talent. Under Carranio's coercion, the people in Poison Fong's research base had modified and upgraded the suppressant to better suppress the growth of the parasites inside their bodies. Although the specialized medicine hadn't been developed yet, it had already solved the urgent problem. At the same time, the combat suits could better protect them from the birds of paradise's attack. However, they were still in a tense state. The slightest tear in their protective suits would turn them into the birds of paradise's target. However, they couldn't wrap themselves up tightly all day long. Eating, drinking, and defecating were unavoidable, so Poison Fang had set up special isolation rooms in many places. The personnel who entered would be scanned multiple times, and they would only be allowed to enter after confirming that they weren't carrying those dangerous insects. A few hours later, the number of birds of paradise had reached a terrifying number. Although Poison Fang didn't do a precise count, someone had done a rough calculation, and the conclusion they came up with made them feel endless panic. They had tried a series of measures such as burning, freezing, and using drugs, but the results weren't very good. These insects were too fast, and their resistance was also very high. The people in the research base even suspected that these insects had decent intelligence. If that was true, then this war between humans and insects would probably be very difficult. These insects were too good at seizing opportunities. Right now, Carreño hated Silin and Emaus to the core. He was certain that either Emaus or Silin was the cause of all of this. No matter who it was, Carreño would definitely make them regret being born into this world. When Carreño learned that the weapons in the armory had disappeared, his gloomy mood turned into a storm. He raised his hand and killed a couple of people who came to report the situation to vent his anger. The internal conflicts within Poison Fang began to grow. Some people wanted to betray Poison Fang like Emaus, but Carreño ruthlessly suppressed them. This caused the already red planet to turn even redder. Knowing that Silin wasn't in the hall, Carreño issued a kill order. Whoever killed Silin would be the next Skeleton King. The moment he said this, Poison Fang's men became excited and suppressed much of the panic brought about by the insects. They all began searching for traces of Silin. Inside a warehouse, 3 Poison Fang members were chatting with their guns. They had just finished their patrol and finally had the chance to sit down and rest. "Those jumping bugs are driving me crazy. This protective suit is so King awkward. I feel like I've suddenly crossed a ton. I feel like an idiot," another person complained. "I'd rather wear this. It's much better than being bitten to death by those jumping bugs." As he spoke, 3 cold lights suddenly shot towards the 3 of them. But it didn't cause them any direct harm. The 3 of them immediately became alert. "Who is it?" One of them raised his gun and looked around warily. It's over. What are you talking about? Hurry up and find him." No, our protective suits are torn." There was no killing intent, no unusual movements. It was just 3 cold lights that appeared out of nowhere. Before the 3 of them could react, they had already cut through their protective suit. The trio stared blankly at the tiny wound on their shoulders, cold sweat dripping down their back. The birds of paradise who had been spying on them from the shadows grew restless. The 3 screams caused the atmosphere in the originally quiet warehouse to become strangely eerie. Hearing the screams, the people around them hurriedly surrounded them. Whoosh! A shadow flashed past them so fast that it was difficult to capture it. Not to mention that they were wearing thick protective suits and their movements were much slower. It was even more impossible for them to capture the shadow that flashed past them. This person raised his gun and pointed it at the surroundings. After looking around, he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. However, the people who had rushed over with him took a few steps back at the same time when they saw him. Because they were all wearing masks, he couldn't see their expressions clearly. However, this person knew that the others definitely didn't look good. What on earth happened? Before he could finish his sentence, an intense pain came from his back. He knew what this meant. Despair, fear, no wonder everyone retreated. "No, I refuse to accept this." "Why are you retreating? Why am I the one who got my protective suit cut? Why am I the one who became a sacrifice for those worms? If I'm going to hell, I'm going to drag you down with me." This person pulled the trigger, and the others around him also opened fire. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of gunshots rang out incessantly. The thick protective suits that ordinary bullets couldn't penetrate were riddled with holes under the various laser bullets. The birds of paradise, who took advantage of the situation, seemed to be very excited. Mixed with screams and curses, blood and smoke, it was like hell. On the other side, at the plaza where Poison Fong used to execute criminals, the people who had been dead for many days were tied to crosses. Right now, at the center of these crosses, Carreño had his men erect special crosses again. They were fire-resistant, super low-temperature resistant, and corrosion-resistant. Unlike in the past, they didn't tie up the criminals this time. Instead, they tied up the native beasts of the planet. As if they knew the danger they were about to face, these beasts struggled and howled with all their might. The metal chains clanked against each other as they struggled. Dressed in protective suit, Carreño sat on a high chair and watched the activity below with his head propped on his hand. These dead people didn't have parasites inside their bodies, and the dead couldn't provide them with good nutrition either. Therefore, they weren't the targets of those jumping worms. That was why Carreño thought of a solution. Although it was a little stupid, it was still a good way to boost the morale of the troops at this stage. The repeated waves of panic had caused Poison Fong's men to become a little nervous. As their leader, Skeleton King naturally had to show his worth as a leader. After the 10 native beasts were tied up, the people on the cross swiftly retreated to the stands. Then, under their expectant gazes, the jumping worms swarmed towards the native beasts tied to the crosses one after another. There were worms of all stages of growth, big and small. Since Poison Fong's men were wearing thick protective suits, they couldn't bite through the protective suits in one go. Instead, they might be caught. The birds of paradise possessed a certain level of intelligence, so they would only attack people with holes in their protective suit. However, it wasn't easy to encounter people with holes in their protective suits for the past few hours. The birds of paradise's reproduction rate was so fast that many worms couldn't obtain enough nutrition. Now that Carreño had released the native beasts, he had undoubtedly given them more food to eat. The native beasts let out tearing wails. Carreño was very satisfied as he watched the worms burrowing into the native beasts' bodies one after another. He was quite impressed by his own foresight. After discovering this scene, he had set up multiple layers of protection around the breeding ground. Originally, it was only to preserve the meat rations, but now it seemed that the meat rations were quite useful. Seeing that the situation was about right, Carreño pressed the button beside him. A transparent barrier suddenly appeared from the ground around the cross field and trapped it inside. Chapter 122. The insects inside the transparent barrier began to grow restless. Some of the insects that had already burrowed into the native beasts' bodies rushed out in an attempt to break through the barrier. Some of the Poison Fong members saw it clearly. Perhaps it was because the insects happened to be in an area where the bones were densely packed. They bit through the native beasts' bones. They opened their mouths wide and let out sharp cries that could be heard even through the transparent barrier. The white bones that had been bitten through the uprooted flesh were very eye-catching. The Poison Fong members who saw this scene unconsciously shuddered. No wonder those who had been bitten had screamed so miserably, and no wonder those who had committed suicide without hesitation the moment they were bitten. Enduring this kind of pain was indeed worse than death. Carreño pressed another button, and several jets appeared inside the transparent barrier. Crimson tongues of flame spat out of the jets, and the transparent barrier was instantly filled with flames. Someone beside him moved closer to Carreño and reported the situation over at the warehouse. Carreño waved his hand and motioned for them to leave it be for now. At the same time, he turned on the communicator and said something. Then, he returned to his previous posture and looked down at the situation below from above. The transparent barrier might have isolated the inside from the outside, but in reality, there were ventilation holes in all 4 directions. These ventilation holes only allowed air to flow, but not the insects inside to escape. Smelling the faint burnt smell in the air, and listening to the sharp cries of the insects inside, the Poison Fong members laughed arrogantly. It was also the most carefree laughter they had heard in the past few hours. However, they did not know that this would be the last time they would laugh like this in their lives. At the same time, Silin and Huimao were hiding somewhere close to Poison Fong's research base. In order to cut off Poison Fong's hope, they had to destroy this research base. Silin knew what kind of place Poison Fong's research base was. It reminded Silin of the underground laboratory in the slum town. It was so cold and merciless, and filled with twisted and crazy people. Huimao was crouching on the ground like a cat with his ears pressed down. His eyes were staring blankly at the research base not far away from him. The defense measures of the base were very good. It only needed to listen, to know that it would not be easy to break in. Otherwise, the defense system outside would directly blast them into pieces. Just as he was about to ask Silin what he should do, he turned around and saw Silin take out something the size of a lunchbox. Huimao was furious. "Silin, you glutton. Now is not the time to eat a boxed meal." Silin. In this world, the one who was least qualified to say such words was this stupid cat. Still eating boxed lunches? Who would be so stupid as to squat in such a place and eat a boxed lunch? Only a gluttonous cat like you would think of that. Silin pinched Huimao's ear. "Good boy, go dig a hole. Drop this thing right under the base and retreat quickly. Pay attention to concealment and shielding, you understand? There's no need to ask questions about such simple things." Huimao picked up the small box with its mouth and dug its front limbs like a drill bit. After predicting the possible underground scanning range, Huimao dug to the depth Silin mentioned and moved towards the base. After confirming the location, it put the small box down and quickly returned along the original path. Before the gray cat could even boast about its achievement, Silin had already grabbed it and started running madly. Before he ran, he didn't forget to throw a few quail eggs. After retreating to a safe area, Silin put Huimao down. "Meow, are you running for your life? Their scanning system has just switched to life signal scanning. Any life signal outside the base will be mercilessly killed by the defense system. It should be the skeleton boss's order." Usually, because there would be guards and patrols around the base, life signal scanning wouldn't be activated. But just now it was activated. Good alertness, but we retreated quickly. They probably didn't notice, right? Huimao looked towards the base. The few quail eggs that Silin had tossed down earlier had been completely annihilated by the defense system. The bugs that were hiding in the dark had also been killed. No, we retreated quickly. If we were a second slower, we wouldn't have survived. That's good. But what is that box? Huimao asked. It's specially prepared for this kind of laboratory. Huimao flicked its ears and continued to stare at the situation. It wanted to see what the specially prepared thing Silin mentioned was. 5 seconds later, the alarm of the entire base rang. Life signal scanning is off. Silin threw a few quail eggs in that direction. From the moment he remotely controlled the switch on the box, the base's scanning system had discovered this thing underground. However, Silin had added some interference devices on the outer shell of the box, so that the scanning system's analysis of the level of danger would take a lot longer. By the time the analysis was completed, there wouldn't be many chances left for the people in the experimental base to escape. Hearing Silin's words, Huimao was about to ask why when he saw the base's gate open. A group of people rushed out, and the entire base began to sink. The screams did not stop, each louder than the one before. There were all kinds of screams of unwillingness, despair, sorrow, and fear. Those who escaped had to face the birds of paradise that had broken out of their shells. There was no way out at the back. Huimao, who was at a loss, suddenly froze. Its fur stood on end. It saw that the base was turning into sand from the inside out. The sandstorm and the birds of paradise were undoubtedly a devastating blow. Although the people wearing protective suits were no longer afraid of the birds of paradise, the thick protective suits affected their movements, causing them to be unable to keep up with the speed of the birds of paradise. They were pulled into the whirlpool and turned into sand. The circular area with a diameter of 500 meters had turned into sand, mixed with the wind and dust of the scarlet sand. Soon, this area would become a part of the scarlet sand region. There would no longer be a base, only a piece of sand. Scylla was a little lost in thought as he looked at the sand. It was as if he had returned to that rainy night when he entered the underground laboratory and was tied to the experiment table. Those people had imposed their madness on the innocent, and then they had achieved glory and left their names in journals with high contribution points. However, did they ever think about those innocent people who were forced to die on the experiment table, and those restless souls? Scylla had no right to criticize those crazier researchers. To a certain extent, Scylla himself was not much better. Who was good and who was evil? Who was right and who was wrong? Scylla did not want to think so much. It was enough to live and live with those who were good to him. Taking a deep breath and smelling the smell of sand mixed with blood, Scylla put aside other complicated thoughts and turned to look at Huimao, who was still stiff and angry, and poked its back with a finger in amusement. Meow! Huimao arched its back and jumped up high. Well, it was scared silly again. Stupid. Coming back to its senses, Huimao angrily jumped onto Scylla's shoulder and stretched out its forelimbs to slap Scylla's face. Okay, my fault. I shouldn't have suddenly attacked you when you were in a daze. I wasn't in a daze, I was just thinking. I was thinking. Yes, thinking. After pacifying Huimao, the man and the cat moved on to the next step. Chapter 123. At the cross field, Carreño stared at the transparent cover with his brows knitted tighter and tighter. The first time they had bound the native beasts and trapped the insects inside the cover, the high-temperature fire had been very effective. It had indeed boosted their low morale greatly, but the second wave had failed. It was obvious that many of the insects would only wander around the perimeter of the cover instead of gathering together. To be more precise, they would only wander around the perimeter of the transparent cover and not step into the area where they were trapped. These insects' intelligence was pretty high, and it annoyed Carreño a lot. Their opponents had always been humans and viruses, and they had never faced such creatures before. When it came to humans, they slaughtered wantonly. When it came to viruses, most Poison Fang members had developed a resistance to them after many experiences. However, Carreño was powerless against these insects. He could only hope that the research base could come up with a countermeasure as soon as possible. Since the beginning, Carreño had a bad feeling. One could even say that it was an ominous feeling. How many years had it been since he fought his way out of Sector V single-handedly until he founded Poison Fang? He had never felt this way before. Suddenly, the communicator in Carreño's hand rang. After he picked up the notification, a terrified, trembling voice came from the other side. "King, the base has been destroyed. The research base has been destroyed." Carreño felt as if a basin of ice had been poured down from the top of his head. It was bone-chilling cold. Inhaling deeply, Carreño tried to find the right syllables. "Didn't I tell you to activate the defense system to its highest level and use the life signature detector to scan the outside?" Carreño was almost roaring at the end of his speech. The originally noisy cross field instantly fell into a dead silence. Even the native beasts tied to the crosses seemed to be scared out of their wits and kept quiet out of fear. The entire cross field was suddenly enveloped by Carreño's anger and killing intent. Bang! Listening to the report from the communicator, Carreño could no longer control himself and crushed the communicator. His two pairs of fangs were almost parallel to the ground. Everyone in Poison Fang knew that this was Skeleton King Carreño's moment of anger. No one dared to breathe loudly. Carreño sat on the chair, his eyes clouded over. "Let's continue." After saying that, Carreño stood up and left, leaving the group of Poison Fang members looking at each other in dismay. After Carreño left the crossfield, he went to an isolation room, took out his communicator, and connected the signal. "Are the researchers still around?" Carreño mentioned a few names. They were the main people in charge of the research on the parasites and the bird of paradise. However, the report from the other side swept away Carreño's wishful thinking. Out of the 5 researchers who were in charge of researching the 2 types of insects, only one was lucky enough to survive. However, it was only survival, and it was unknown how long he could last. This was because the last remaining researcher was also in a state of severe injuries. A bird of paradise had bitten through his lungs, and at the same time, his liver and kidneys were also bitten. The other researchers who had escaped tried their best to rescue him and force the bird of paradise out of his body. However, everyone knew that without the relevant equipment and the relevant materials from the experimental base, it would be very difficult for this person to survive. The research lab was located at the innermost part of the base, and it was the lab with the best security. At the same time, it was also the first place to suffer from desertification. It was already a miracle that they were able to escape, but there was no helping it. There was still a hungry bird of paradise that had just hatched and was waiting for them outside the base. All of the information and research results, even if they weren't the final results, had reached a certain level of research. It was only a matter of time before the analysis was complete. Everything had turned to sand. Sillen wanted to see them being pushed step by step towards the cliff of despair, and be punished in panic and despair. By now, Carreño was very certain that everything was planned by Sillen. That seemingly simple and honest young man was actually a devil, and he had brought disaster upon them. Since he couldn't catch Sillen, Carreño really wanted to act against Emmaus and Joaquin. But there was no other way. With Emmaus' abilities, he couldn't touch Emmaus at all without the relevant weapons and equipment. It would only be a waste of combat power. Carreño was very regretful. Poison Fang had been too reliant on Emmaus for the past few years. He didn't feel it normally, but after he truly separated Emmaus, he realized that Emmaus' hand was everywhere. After some thought, Carreño issued the highest order for Poison Fang to hunt down Sillen at all costs, disregarding all other matters at the moment. Since Sillen was able to bring these insects here and avoid their invasion at the same time, it meant that Sillen had a way to deal with these insects. He couldn't count on the experimenters anymore, so Carreño placed his final hope on Sillen. At the same time, he let every Poison Fang member know that Sillen had a way to avoid the insects. The little Poison Fang members searched even harder. At this time, Sillen, the person whom Carreño hated to the bone, brought Huimao to a deserted airport. Carreño had already abandoned this airport, and there were a few spaceplanes and fighter jets parked there. Both the spaceplanes and fighter jets have a self-destruct program, and there's also a remote-controlled bomb. The main controller should be in Carreño's hands. If we take off in a spaceplane or fighter jet, it will definitely explode like fireworks in less than 2 seconds. This was also a trap Carreño had set up after Akai and the others had left in the spaceplane. Controlling the spaceplanes and fighter jets would prevent Sillen and the others from escaping even if he couldn't catch them. Sillen's words had undoubtedly caused Huimao, who was planning to fly a spaceplane for fun, to retreat far away. Right now, Huimao was afraid of a lot of human weapons. The more it came into contact with them, the more it knew that there were enough things in human weapons that could turn an extremely rare miracle creature like it into dust. After a round of inspection, Sillen walked onto a spaceplane. Everyone who could escape had done so, and those who couldn't had become the bird of paradise's delicious meal. A person who was half lying at the entrance of the passage, unable to avoid the bird of paradise's poisonous fangs in time, had already been bitten beyond recognition. When Sillen walked to his side, the bird of paradise's eggs had just hatched in his body. The birds of paradise that had crawled out were extremely excited to see a living human in front of them. However, they stopped just as they were about to move. The human in front of them had a special aura that made them shrink back. At the same time, it was as familiar as their mother's. No matter which one it was, it dispelled their desire to attack. As for Huimao, the birds of paradise didn't dare to attack him at all. This abnormal life form was too dangerous. The baby birds of paradise obediently crawled out and went to find other life forms. "All right, let's go," Silin said to Huimao. "What did you do?" "Nothing much. I just took the energy blocks inside." Realization dawned on Huimao. "I see. Is there anything valuable left? When we leave this place, we can sell them for a good price to pay off our debt." Silin smiled and patted the cat's head. "No, let's go. Let's go to the next spaceplane." "Hee, all right. It's mine if I get it first." "Let's go find our own. Be careful, don't touch the other power devices. If you accidentally start the spaceplane, I'll have to erect another cross here." I know. I don't need you to tell me about machinery." Huimao flicked his ears and went to look for the energy blocks inside other spaceplanes and fighters. Poor Carreño. He had originally set up a trap, but he didn't expect that Silin and Huimao would squeeze out the last bit of value from him. Silin looked at the sky. According to the original plan, the hunt was about to begin. He tore off the skull emblem on the chest of the man who had been bitten by the birds of paradise and walked out of the spaceplane. Chapter 124. After the Skeleton King issued Carreño's highest kill order, the Poison Fang members began to move one after another. Coupled with Carreño's declaration that Silin had a way to deal with those insects, the Poison Fang members searched tirelessly like they had seen their last hope. However, they couldn't even find Silin's shadow. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, but there was one thing that proved that Silin was still active in this area. "King, their emblems have all been taken away," a person reported to Carreño. The emblems on the chests of the dead Poison Fang members in every area had been taken away. Carreño did not say a word. He knew that this was Silin's act of revenge. He had taken away the emblems made from the bones of every Poison Fang member and used them as a memorial to the Vanguard Division's 6 members who had died in the previous battle. On the other side, a search party consisting of a dozen or so people had their protective suits cut open one after another, but they still couldn't see the person who did it. They had accidentally hurt a few of their companions when they used their life signal detection, but they did not regret it. At the very least, it gave them peace of mind. Silin did not take action himself. Instead, he set up some traps and moved around outside of their detection range. While the dozen or so people were searching, one of them touched something, and some throwing knives suddenly shot out of the ground. These throwing knives were made of special metal, and even if they couldn't completely cut open the protective suit in one go, they could still make a shallow cut. This was enough to make these Poison Fang members tremble in fear. Silin's goal wasn't to cut open their protective suits in one go, but to increase their mental pressure. Throwing knives, guns outside of their detection range, burning smoke grenades, and all kinds of other mischievous tricks made these Poison Fang members want to commit suicide. There was a limit to how tense a person could be. Once this limit was exceeded, they would either become a lunatic or mentally ill. If the protective suit could survive the first time, what about the second, third, or even 7th time? Poison Fang knew that there would always be a cut, but what they didn't know was when it would happen. These people walked to a corner with tense nerves, and with a click, they stepped on something. Then, a large area of flames suddenly appeared on the ground. The ground was originally covered with a layer of medicine, so it was not a threat. There were also some small balls on the ground that were very similar to the color of the ground. These small balls contained another kind of chemical. When the small ball was stepped on, the chemical inside would be released. When the chemical came into contact with the chemical on the ground, it would cause a violent burning reaction when it came into contact with oxygen. Then, the poison fangs would dodge in panic, and as they dodged, they would step on even more of the little balls. In the end, it would cause a large area of high-temperature flames to surround them. The flames surrounded them, burning their protective suits. Although the suits could withstand the high temperature for a while, they couldn't stay for long. They quickly ran away, but the road was covered with chemicals. Although the original road did not have those balls, the substances inside the balls were still on the soles of their feet. As they ran, they would carry the substances inside the balls to other places that were covered with chemicals. In other words, wherever they ran on this road that was covered with chemicals, there would be a fire. Finally, he was out of the range of the flames, but a blood-curdling scream rang out. Following that was a second person, then a third. It turned out that those people's protective suits already had shallow cut. The protective suits with shallow cuts could no longer withstand the high temperature of the flames, and a hole was torn open. The birds of paradise took the opportunity to burrow in. After torturing the poison fangs to the brink of insanity, they were finally attacked by the birds of paradise. After that, only 2 lucky fellows were left with their protective suits that had not been torn open. However, before they could catch their breath, a figure flashed by, and 2 holes were slashed on their back. After being burned by the flames, the detector also malfunctioned, so it failed to send out an alarm in time. The last 2 people in this group had also fallen. 5 minutes later, Silen slowly walked out of a building. He cut open the protective suits on the chests of the poison fangs that had been bitten beyond recognition and took away the emblem. Carreño listened to one report after another that made his veins pop. He was so angry that he smashed his chair a few times. Through the transparent cover of the mask, 2 pairs of fangs could be seen parallel to the ground. Bring this king's pets over. Take care to protect them. Yes. Upon receiving the Skeleton King's order, the few people beside him ran out to carry it out as though they were fleeing. Facing the Skeleton King was indeed stressful. Inside the hall, El Mouse and Joaquin were leaning against a box of energy ores as they chatted and probed each other. However, both of them were at the level of foxes, so it was rare for them to get anything useful out of each other. Just then, someone came in and looked at the 2 people inside the 4-layered energy barrier. However, he did not say a word and moved a few chairs away from the hall. "What are they doing?" Joaquin asked. "I'm guessing that Carreño is about to release his little pet. TSK. Looks like Carreño's brain isn't so stupid that it's negative. He finally thought of this method," El Mouse said while stroking his chin, his eyes dark and unreadable. Joaquin directly filtered out the latter part of El Mouse's words and asked in puzzlement, "Little pets?" "That's right. Just like how a dog can track its target based on smell, Carreño's little pets have an extraordinary sense of smell." Joaquin began to worry. Many people said that an animal's sense of smell was more sensitive than a detector, not to mention a species that had a considerable advantage in smell. Silen had previously sat on a chair in the hall and left behind a scent. Carreño was going to track Silen based on the scent that Silen had left on the chair. He did not know what that kid Silen would do. As he thought about it, Joaquin suddenly thought of something. His eyebrows relaxed and there was even a hint of a smile in his eyes. El Mouse was undoubtedly an observant person. He caught the smile in Joaquin's eyes. "Vice Captain Joaquin, looks like you have a lot of confidence in Silen. Tell me what you think of so I don't have to worry too much." Joaquin did not speak and directly ignored El Mouse. Carreño's little pets were not small. They were more than 1 meter tall and 2 meters long. They were also a native 4-legged mammal species of this planet. They had a keen sense of smell and a good sense of danger. After putting on the emergency protective suits specially made for these pets, each search party led 2 of them out. With the help of these little pets, Poison Fang's search became much more convenient. Silen had moved around in many places, so it was impossible to say that he did not leave any traces behind. Each search party led Carreño's pets and followed the scent everywhere. In the end, after going around in circles, every search party's target was the same: the crossfield. Chapter 125. Although they had found a way to hunt down and kill Silen, panic still shrouded Poison Fong. Discounting those who wandered outside of Sector Z, Poison Fong originally numbered almost 100,000 people on this planet. But now, Carreño suddenly discovered that there were less than 50,000 of them left before he knew it. No one had expected that a mere Silen, a bastard who was completely unknown in the galaxy, would be able to kill more than 50,000 people on this planet. Of course, these 50,000 people were basically buried in the stomachs of the worms. Other than the birds of paradise, the original little parasites had slowly developed a resistance to the primary inhibitor after the research base had been decertified. Once they had developed a resistance, then the Poison Fong people who were parasitized by these little parasites would not be able to hold on for long. Without the birds of paradise, the parasitized people were like living nutrient providers who were slowly sucked dry by the little parasite. While they were chasing after Silen, a lot of Poison Fong members collapsed while they were running, and they never got up again after they fell. Inside their bodies, a large number of little parasites were dividing and multiplying every minute. The parasites that had developed resistance to the parasites were like starving refugees who had suddenly seen a table full of delicious food. Therefore, to the Poison Fong people, it only took a few minutes to go from weakness to death. But during these few minutes, they could clearly feel the process of their own weakness and the loss of their life. It was as if a devil's hand was pulling their souls slowly towards hell. There was no struggle, only despair. The research base. This was no doubt a sharp knife to Carreño's heart. It was also the biggest slap to the face Carreño had endured in all these years. In reality, the destruction of Poison Fong's research base contained many factors. The Scarlet Sand region's geographical environment accelerated the rate of desertification, and the research base was not discovered in time. By the time the desertification reached the research base, it was already too late to stop it. Moreover, no one would have thought that a cyborg who could dig holes and block scanning signals would appear in this place. That was why Carreño still didn't know why something like this had happened all of a sudden. However, since it had already happened, it was already too late to investigate the cause. Right now, Carreño had placed all of his energy on hunting down Silen. Night slowly descended around the crossfield. To Poison Fong, night was once their favorite time. They loved to slaughter under the cover of night and listen to their prey's terrified and despairing cries. However, the current situation was different. Silen was like a silent catcher hiding in the shadows, pushing them to the brink of collapse step by step. What would happen if night fell? The Poison Fangs didn't dare to imagine. The night belongs to the devil. The temperature difference between day and night on the planet was huge. Although the thick protective suits could keep them warm, they always felt abnormally cold. The kind of cold that numbed their scalp, and every pore on their body exuded cold air, stimulated their nerves, and tightened them again and again. The pets had followed the scent to the crossfield, but they could only wander around the edge of the crossfield. They could not confirm Silen's general location or pinpoint his exact location. This was undoubtedly another blow to Poison Fong. 50,000 people had silently gathered at the edge of the crossfield and formed a circle to surround it. But no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find Silen's figure. No matter how hard they searched and turned the crossfield upside down. They searched every inch of the crossfield like madmen, but the result was like a cold joke mocking their incompetence. Another person fell. Someone fell at every moment. This crossfield was like a devil's domain that absorbed the souls of these people at every moment. The night, the blood, the crosses, and the people fell one after another. The sinners, who had been dead for many days, and the native beasts, who had been gnawed by the birds of paradise to the point where only a few incomplete bones were left, laughed at the people surrounding them amidst the whistling wind. It was as if they were waiting for these people to accompany them. An hour later, 2 out of 5 people were gone, and only 30,000 were left. 20,000 people had fallen just like that. There were no loud gunshots, no bloody slaughter. They had simply fallen. They had never experienced such a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness before. For the first time, their hands that held their guns trembled. They had killed again and again, walked through the bloody battlefield, and watched their prey struggle to their deaths pointlessly under their blades and muzzles. They thought that they could face the Azura hell in peace, but in the end, they discovered that true hell did not require terrible screams or gunfire. In this quiet battlefield, they could watch as Azrael's hand grabbed their throats and took their souls away. Half an hour later, there were only 10,000 people left. The pace of death grew even faster. The remaining people were undoubtedly the elites of Poison Fang. Their gene rank allowed them to hold out longer, but they could only hold on. Without the suppressant, they had only slowed down their march to hell. So what if they had rank A genes? They had no choice but to admit defeat in front of these minuscule lifeforms. The current Poison Fang was no longer under Caragno's control. Poison Fang had always been an uncontrollable group to begin with. Poison Fang was neither an army nor a hunter regiment. They were just people who had gathered together to satisfy the pleasure of reaping live. Under Silen's constant pressure, their taut nerves finally reached a tipping point: madness. The remaining people had gone mad. Since they were going to die sooner or later, they might as well enjoy this final moment of madness. The people in the aircraft in the air began to fire at the ground. The flames illuminated the flesh and blood that were blown away by the shells and the birds of paradise that were leaping among them. The killing stimulated their excitement, and they laughed even more crazily. Those who had lost their rationality raised the guns in their hands and either shot at others or themselves. Perhaps many of them had never thought that they would be the ones to reap their lives in the end. Caragno sat quietly at a high place and watched the chaotic battle between the aircrafts and aircrafts below. He was so quiet that he looked like an outsider. Around him lay people who had been torn to shreds. The current Caragno was not wearing a protective suit, but no birds of paradise could approach him. The current Caragno was the real Caragno, the skeleton king that not even the birds of paradise dared to approach. Poison Fang knew that Silen could make those insects avoid him, but they didn't know that their king could do the same. Caragno knew that Silen was also watching the scene quietly from a certain place. Who was more despicable? Who was more cruel? Those who knew Poison Fang said that they were a bunch of lunatics, but Caragno felt that Silen was even colder, crazier, and more like a devil than Poison Fang. Chapter 126. The dark night, the blood, the slaughter, and the coldness that flowed through the pores of the thick protective suits stimulated the madness in Poison Fang's hearts. Kill, 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 until they could no longer move a muscle. The cross erected at the center of the square bore witness to the madness of Poison Fang. After the commotion, the ruined cross field was filled with blood, flesh, flying sand, stone fragments, metal wreckage, and fire. In less than 15 minutes, all that was left of the 10,000 or so people was a single spaceplane and 2 fighter jets engaged in a final battle. Silen and Huimao watched everything quietly. They hadn't stayed around the crossfield before this. Using a beast's sense of smell to create traps was something Silen often did. That was why Silen had left behind a special scent that could be retained for a longer period of time from the moment he stepped onto Poison Fang's transport, to the Great Hall, and all the way until he set up the trap at the crossfield. It was all for the sake of gathering the group of people at the crossfield. Now that all the scanners in the area had been destroyed and Caragno's pets had been killed a long time ago, Silen and Huimao approached the crossfield and watched the final madness of Poison Fang in the sky. Silen, leave the last 3 to me. Huimao had been holding back for a long time. Originally, Huimao was going to show off his might when Silen forbade him from attacking. He was incredibly disappointed now. No, it's already come to this. You should just stay put and see if there are any survivors on the ground. Let's finish them off and fish out their emblems. Sillen had his own concerns. He didn't want Huimao to expose too much of himself. A minute later, the 2 fighter jets were destroyed and the spaceplane exploded in midair. Everything returned to normal. After a moment of silence, Carreño's voice rang. Hee, Vanguard Division 6 Sillen, you've surprised this king. Although he was laughing, there was an indescribable coldness in his voice. Skeleton King Carreño slowly walked out of a half-collapsed building like he was taking a stroll. The collapsed buildings didn't seem to affect the Skeleton King at all. In the past, Carreño would have never believed that 50,000 people were annihilated in 2 hours or so, and Sillen hadn't even done anything himself. Moreover, these people had not died cleanly. It could be said that these 50,000 people had been forced to their death step by step. They had experienced terror, despair, helplessness, and the process of their lives slipping away. From the moment Sillen stepped into the crossfield, Carreño had locked his gaze onto Sillen. His night vision was pretty good. He stared closely at Sillen, afraid that he would escape in the next moment. However, Sillen did not plan to escape. It was time to end this matter. To Carreño, the death of 100,000 people stationed on the planet really wasn't that big of a blow. Even if these 100,000 people were gone, he could just take a stroll around Sector V and gather new batches of poison fong. Moreover, there were plenty of desperados in the galaxy, and 100,000 people was just a number. Therefore, to Carreño, the most important thing was not the death of these 100,000 people, but Sillen himself. Carreño was going to tear this devil-like brat into 1,000 pieces, burn his bones, and scatter his ashes. Swoosh! Carreño charged at Sillen like lightning. Under the scattered firelight, Sillen could see his body clearly. His body had doubled in size, and there were curved fangs growing out of his torso. There was also a huge black shadow behind Carreño. That was his tail, a barbed tail. When he was charging, the tail swung to increase his momentum and speed. Sillen knew that Carreño wasn't a normal human, but he didn't think that Carreño's true form would look like this. Moreover, the information Schotten had shown Sillen didn't contain Carreño's true situation either. It had to be said that Carreño had hidden himself very well. It was likely that even Emaus, who had been hiding in Poison Fong for so many years, didn't know Carreño's true appearance. As Carreño got closer, a thick, murderous aura hit him in the face. No wonder those birds of paradise didn't dare approach him. It was likely that those little parasites didn't affect Carreño much. At most, they would be a little bit at the time, but they would be forced to death by Carreño later on. Carreño's mask and thick protective clothing were all for show. In reality, Carreño didn't need them at all. This was suppression, true suppression. It was a power that completely surpassed a normal human's ability in genetic state. Perhaps Carreño didn't belong to a single genus. He might be an unconventional person who possessed the bloodline of several genera and absorbed the advantages of each species to become the skeleton king he was today. Sillen thought that his physical constitution was pretty good, especially when he was in a solidified state. However, it was only after he clashed with Carreño that he realized just how strong this skeleton king was. He blocked both Carreño's hand and Carreño's sweeping tail at the same time. His arm felt numb for a moment. What kind of physique was this? He bent his body and backed away, avoiding the 2 rows of sharp teeth on Carreño's torso. To be more precise, they could be considered the specialized bones on Carreño's torso. He looked huge, but his movements were nimble and his attack speed was very fast. Coupled with his physical advantage of having 2 hands, 2 legs, a tail and the 2 rows of specialized bones on his torso, Sillen really couldn't do anything to him for now. Even the current Sillen wouldn't be able to get the upper hand in a head-on clash. Carreño was rich in combat experience, and he knew the weaknesses of humans. His attacks were swift and fierce, and every one of his attacks carried the determination to kill. As the king of Poison Fong, Carreño's presence was overwhelming. A normal person wouldn't have the courage to resist just standing in front of Carreño, much less fight him. Sillen retreated step by step while blocking Carreño's attack. Carreño was so strong that Sillen had no choice but to retreat every time he blocked an attack to neutralize the impact. At the same time, he had to deal with the rain of fists, claws, and annoying tail. Sillen parried the claws with long, sharp nails and dodged to the side. Then, he leapt into the air and kicked Carreño's sweeping tail. Using the force of the tail, he jumped backwards. While he was in the air, 2 guns appeared in Sillen's hands. Bang bang bang! The bullets flew at Carreño from the front and 2 sides. Carreño, who was chasing after him, did not dodge. His tail flattened and covered Carreño's body like a cloak. When the bullets collided with his tail, the sound of metal clanging could be heard. The bullets that hit Carreño's tail would at most leave a mark or break the surface layer of skin. It would recover in no time. Sillen narrowed his eyes. When he landed on the ground, he exerted strength in his legs and continued to retreat. This time, it wasn't bullets but flying knives. They weren't much slower than bullets, and they attacked from 3 directions at the same time. Carreño used the same method and widened his flattened tail to cover his body. The flying knives made cracking sounds when they hit his tail. However, the cracking sound was followed by the sound of corrosion. Chapter 127. Sillen would never fight head-on like an idiot and ask for abuse when he knew he was weaker than his opponent. The flying dagger was specially made by Sillen before he arrived. The dagger was not thin, and the brittle outer shell was wrapped in a strong corrosive liquid. In order to seal the corrosive liquid inside the dagger, Sillen even used some expensive inert materials to prevent the corrosive liquid from corroding the outer shell of the dagger. In fact, Sillen's original idea was to use the outer shell of the dagger to scratch the surface of the opponent's body, and then let the corrosive liquid seep into the opponent's wound to inflict the greatest amount of damage. However, even if the dagger could not scratch the opponent's skin, the corrosive liquid that splashed out from the broken dagger would still be useful. Now it was indeed the case. The liquid splashed on Carreño's flattened tail, and the pain from the corrosion made Carreño very angry. "This kid is playing tricks again." Carreño let out a long roar, as though he was venting all the anger in his chest. The sound waves shattered the remnants of the crosses that had been destroyed to the point where only a part of them remained. Huimao, who was squatting on a cross that only had a third of its original shape left, jumped down and flicked his ears. For him, this level of sound wave was not enough to hurt him, but he had to find a better place to watch the fight. Carreño's roar traveled far. Even El Mouse and Joaquin inside the energy barrier of the hall heard it. "That's..." Joaquin was surprised. "It should be the Skeleton King's roar," said El Mouse. However, he could also hear the anger in the voice. To be able to force the Skeleton King to this extent, Sillen was indeed very surprising. After all, according to El Mouse's understanding, the Skeleton King, Carreño, would not let out such a roar even if all his subordinates were killed. Carreño was really angry, extremely angry. After so many years, apart from being injured by that person, until now, Carreño had never been so sullen. A common human, a young brat, not only had he killed his 100,000 subordinates, he had even injured him. Carreño threw caution to the wind. At most, he would just lose one of his tails. It would grow back after a few years. All he had to bear was a moment of pain. What he needed to do now was to crush this cunning brat. As long as he didn't clash head-on, Sillen was able to dodge. In this crossfield, one was retreating while the other was pursuing. Sillen was still retreating and throwing his flying daggers. A layer of Carreño's tail had already been corroded. Carreño was already numb to the pain in his tail. He did not believe that Sillen could continue retreating like this. Sillen was not in a hurry. Carreño was currently in a state of rage. This was a good sign, because in a state of rage, Carreño did not have much brainpower to think about other things. When Sillen was very young, he had heard a conversation like this. Do you know why the hunter is superior to the prey? The hunter is stronger than the prey. Only the strong are the hunters, while the weak are the prey. No, because the hunter will set traps. To the fish, the angler was the hunter. They would cast the bait and quietly wait for the fish to take the bait. The people who lived in the forest would set traps to catch large and ferocious beasts. Perhaps when they were excited, they would watch the trapped beast fight. They had long been used to using the smallest amount of effort to catch their prey. Sillen and Carreño both saw the other as prey. But in the end, who would be crowned as the prey? When Carreño realized that something was wrong, it was already too late. The first thing that had happened was his tail. Then, the numbness quickly spread to the rest of his body. Only now did Carreño realize that the cunning kid was playing tricks again. The highly corrosive liquid had corroded the surface layer of Carreño's tail, allowing the toxins behind it to play a better role. The same throwing knife, the same proportion, but the completely different inside. Not to mention Carreño, even El Mouse might not have thought of this. If the proportion was different, El Mouse might have become suspicious and guessed that there was a difference in the throwing knife. But when Sillen made these, he had completely taken this situation into consideration. The highly corrosive liquid and the concentrated neurotoxin. When Sillen made these two kinds of liquids, he had deliberately taken their proportion into account. However, even if they were not of the same proportion with the current Carreño, he was afraid that he would not notice it. At the same time, his selective ignorance of the pain in his tail had caused Carreño to notice the first poisonous throwing knife. By the time he did notice it, too much of the toxin had already seeped into his tail, and it had spread to the point where he could no longer save it. El Mouse's evaluation of Carreño after hiding in Poison Fang for so many years was that Carreño was ruthless, strong, smart, but not smart enough and not cautious enough. His past achievements had caused the Skeleton King to overlook too many potential threats. He had always thought that he was standing at the top, and that he could look down on the ants below him. But in reality, he had been pulled down into the abyss before he could truly understand how lonely it was to be at the top. Sillen had collected the neurotoxin in the vines that had once poisoned Carrie. On the green planet, Sillen had also collected other neurotoxins from plants and animals. The current one was something Sillen had specially prepared for Carreño. Inside Engi's workshop, Sillen had bred 2 types of insects, mixed them with a highly corrosive liquid, and synthesized this neurotoxin that even a rank A genotype could not withstand. Carreño could only feel that everything around him was moving further and further away. His hearing, touch, smell, and taste seemed to be deteriorating, and every joint was rusting like scrap metal. Moreover, the rust was getting worse and worse, and his movements were becoming slower and slower. Every muscle was spasming, and his breathing was rapid but irregular. For some reason, Carreño felt that no matter how much he breathed, the oxygen he breathed in was not enough to satisfy his need. His mind was becoming more and more muddled, and the sporadic sparks seemed to burn his eyes. He could not help but look into the darkness. Not far away, Hui Mao was squatting on top of a pile of rubble and watching the battle with wide eyes. At this moment, he tilted his head and looked at the man who was walking in an S shape just a moment ago. His nimble and ever-changing tail was dragging weakly on the ground, and Carreño looked like a drunkard as he staggered through the ruins. Sillen stood 100 meters away from Carreño and watched as Carreño moved towards him step by step. However, the effects of the neurotoxin had severely affected Carreño's senses and thoughts. He slowly deviated from his path and finally collapsed on the spot where he once punished sinners and watched slaughter. In the past, it was Carreño, Poison Fang's Skeleton King, who sat on a high place and watched the ant-like beings on the ground suffer bloody battles and torture. But now, the roles had changed. It was as if Carreño could see him lying under a giant cross, and the devil-like young man standing at the top of the cross, watching indifferently as he struggled in silence. His throat could no longer produce any precise syllables, and all that came out were indiscernible grunts. In truth, he only wanted to say one word, devil. Sillen still stood at a distance and watched expressionlessly. There was no coldness, no mockery, no joy or relief after revenge in his eyes. His eyes were as calm as ever. A while later, Sillen took out a small marble-like object and flicked it at Carreño, who was lying in the ruins. The marble hit Carreño's body and scattered around Carreño. The wind blew past. The surviving birds of paradise, around the ruins, smelled the scent in the air and swarmed towards Carreño. Sillen closed his eyes and sensed the remaining commotion above the ruins. It's time to end this. Chapter 128. When the first ray of light shone upon the ruins, the dust in the air had already settled down. The only things floating above the ruins were the lingering smell of gunfire and flesh and blood. Inside the great hall, the 4 energy shields gradually faded and dissipated. It was time. According to Sillen, they could walk out of this place without needing to change the energy shields when they dissipated. Moreover, at some point in time, not a single Poison Fang member was left around the great hall. Thinking was one thing, but El Mouse and Joaquin could not take the first step. Both of them were veterans. After the energy shields had dissipated, the lingering aura in the air became even more obvious. It was as if it was telling them the faint experience of fear and despair hidden in the darkness. El Mouse and Joaquin looked around warily. El Mouse was ready to throw out more energy shields at any moment. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes later, Joaquin inhaled deeply and took the first step. Since Joaquin had taken the first step, El Mouse followed suit. The duo moved their feet step by step. All of the surveillance equipment had been destroyed, and El Mouse could not obtain any images from them. There were a few Poison Fang members who had been dead for a long time lying around the Great Hall, but there were no more than 10 of them. If they were to rely on their hearing alone, they could tell that there was no one around them. When El Mouse activated the scanner, it also showed that there were no living people nearby. El Mouse knew very well how many Poison Fang members were stationed on this planet. That was why he dared not believe the situation in front of him. After all, the area around the Great Hall was a core area, wasn't it? Forget 30 or 50,000, there should be at least 10,000 people, right? But in reality, there was not a single living person on the scanner. At most, a few bugs would occasionally jump past them. El Mouse and Joaquin had an indescribable fear towards bugs. Perhaps it was because Sillen had shocked them too much earlier, but they instinctively wanted to run when they saw the bugs jump past them. However, the bugs seemed to be uninterested in them, so they felt a lot more at ease. However, this peace of mind didn't last for long. The two of them saw a hole suddenly burst open in the chest of a dead man. The clear sound of bones breaking made Emus and Joaquin quickly adjust their guns in that direction. They didn't even bother to wipe the cold sweat that was dripping down their foreheads as they stared straight at the place where the sound came from. Then, they saw a bug slightly larger than the one they saw earlier run out of the person's chest. After the insect glanced at them, it quickly left their line of sight. Emus and Joaquin wouldn't overlook the bug's preemptive attack the instant it saw them. However, the bug stopped its attack in the end, glanced at them, and then left. Fear. It was not the instant destruction, but the torturous approach to death step by step. They knew what was in front of them, but they could not avoid it. It was at this moment that El Mouse and Joaquin seemed to recall some of the things that had happened before. Fear. It was not the instant annihilation, but the torturous death that approached step by step. They knew what was in front of them, but they could not avoid it. The duo was silent for a few minutes. In the end, El Mouse said, "Let's go take a look at the crossfield." After all, a large-scale battle happened there. They had heard the commotion from the Great Hall earlier. Joaquin could not contact Sillen, so he did not object to El Mouse's suggestion. Although he was mentally prepared, he could not calm down when he saw it for himself. It was like a sacrificial ceremony paved with flesh and blood, supported by the flames of war. Broken limbs and remains were everywhere, and there was not a single flat spot in the huge cross field. The place that was once Poison Fang's recreation ground and bloody execution ground for punishing sinners was now a pile of ruins. 50,000 people had died here, but not a single complete corpse could be seen. Some of them had been eaten until only bones remained. What on earth happened here? This was Poison Fang we're talking about. The famous group of lunatics in Sector V. The duo stood at the edge of the cross field and stared at the man at the center of the ruins with complicated gazes. A lens popped out of the device in El Mouse's left eye. Through it, he could see the situation inside the cross field clearly and record it all at the same time. There was a cross more than 5 meters tall at the center of the cross field, and Poison Fang's emblems were piled underneath it. El Mouse did not know how many emblems there were, but the fact that they were here meant that the owners of the emblems were dead. Lying on top of the emblems was a skeleton. It did not look like the skeleton of a normal human, and there were 2 rows of specialized bones at the torso. On top of the cross, Sillen was sitting casually. He was holding a book in his hand and reading slowly. A gray cat was squatting on his shoulder. Its eyes were narrowed, and it looked very comfortable. Sillen's voice was neither fast nor slow, but it was very comfortable. It was like a cool breeze that swept through the ruins, calming the restless heart inexplicably in this land surrounded by red sand. Emus didn't know what language it was, but the translation device translated it right away. It was Standard Sector X's sector language. The dying criminal listens to the honest cries in his heart nestled in the universe in this ridiculously beautiful starry skywind and rain ushered in the era birds from heaven passing by the human realm. Sillen ignored the arrival of Emus and Hua-Qing and continued to read on his own. The light that slowly rose from his back caused the man, the cat, the pile of symbols and the cross to form a long shadow in front of him. There was a saying in the League of Stars that 50 years made a generation. It had been almost 50 years since the glory of the previous generation. Was the new generation about to rise? El Mouse smiled. Poison Fang's infiltration mission was over, and if there were no accidents after he returned to the military, his peak was about to arrive. In that case, how many people would become the leaders of this new era? No matter what, El Mouse was glad that his peak was in this era. Even if he could not become a leader, he could at least witness the glory of this era. Vanguard Division 6 Sillen. Compared to the 6th Division's Commander Schotten, and compared to the other B Squadron commanders of Vanguard, El Mouse believed that Sillen was more than qualified to enter the Hunt ranking. The Hunt ranking was a ranking the military made specifically for hunters. Only the higher-ups of the military knew the names on the Hunt ranking. Anyone who was listed on the Hunt ranking would receive special treatment from the military, even more so than Skeleton King and Carano. Right now, El Mouse did not know what kind of treatment this was, but perhaps he would know very soon. At this time, Sillen had finished reading the poem in the book. He closed the book, but did not jump down from the cross. "You're here." Chapter 129. El Mouse and Hua-Qing walked over. It was still the same brown-haired, honest-looking young man that Hua-Qing was familiar with. He still wore the same smile, but his attitude towards Sillen was completely different. Facing Sillen like this, El Mouse and Hua-Qing felt a chill rise in their hearts at the same time. More than 20 hours had passed, and 100,000 people had been wiped out. However, the person who caused all of this still wore his usual expression and was leisurely reading a poem on a morning like this. It was as if the ruins and corpses beneath his feet were nothing more than an insignificant background. Hua-Qing swallowed and asked carefully, "Sillen, those people from Poison Fang, they're probably dead." "Dead? They're all dead?" Hua-Qing opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. Should he rejoice that the 6th Division had produced such a talent? Lieutenant Akai and the others have left on a spaceship, but I don't know the specifics. The captain will send a starship over. I don't know when it will arrive, but I believe it won't be too long. Sillen said. Is that Carreño? El Mouse pointed at the skeleton on top of the pile of emblems and asked. Yes. Sillen nodded. Both El Mouse and Joaquin stared at the skeleton in great surprise. El Mouse clicked his tongue in wonder, so Carreño's true face has never been revealed. Although only Carreño's skeleton was left, it was obvious that Carreño was different from before. Can I collect some data? El Mouse asked Sillen. Right now, El Mouse was obviously more wary of Sillen than anything else. Moreover, Carreño was Sillen's prey. If he wanted to study someone else's prey, he should at least inform the hunter first, right? That's fine. Name a price. Name a price? El Mouse only reacted after a long time. He smiled and said, Of course you can name the price. After all, the prey is yours. The inert materials Sillen used to design Carreño's flying knife were very expensive, and the composition of corrosive fluids and neurotoxins also required some costs. Therefore, before making these things, Sillen made a list. He couldn't lose money, right? Yes, there was also the cost of labor. Sillen decisively raised a finger. 10 million. 10 million? Joaquin almost shouted. Carreño's head might be priceless, but El Mouse only needed to collect information about this skeleton. 10 million for this? El Mouse stared at Sillen's eyes for a while and knew that this kid was not joking. Sure, but I don't have that much money right now. That's fine. Sillen took out the Vanguard's special receipt and began to write it skillfully. After he was done, he handed it to El Mouse. See if there are any other questions. If there are no questions, please sign here. El Mouse looked at the receipt in his hand. The corner of his eyes twitched and he sighed in his heart. He really did not know where Vanguard Division 6 found such a monster. After El Mouse signed the receipt, he squatted down to look at some data about the skeleton. After seeing the data, El Mouse felt a lot more balanced. According to the data, it was indeed worth 10 million. It would have been better if the skin and flesh were still there. Unfortunately, there was only a skeleton left. It was hard to imagine that the arrogant and tyrannical skeleton king would end up in such a state. However, when El Mouse was collecting information, he noticed a pair of eyes staring at him. At first, he thought it was Sillen or Joaquin, but later he felt that something was wrong. El Mouse turned his head and saw the Huimao squatting on Sillen's shoulder staring at him with its round eyes, as if guarding against thieves. Guarding against thieves? El Mouse was puzzled. Why is a cat staring at me like that? Although Carreño did not tell El Mouse about Huimao looking for energy ores, El Mouse had his own way of finding out. Therefore, he knew that this should be the talking cat that could find energy ores. However, why would Sillen bring it to such a dangerous place? Wasn't he afraid that this cat would not be able to return? The man and the cat stared at each other. Huimao had adopted a strategy of not moving if the enemy did not move. If the enemy moved, it would not move. Knowing that El Mouse was from the military, Huimao was much more careful. It was not as casual as it was with other hunters. Seeing that Huimao did not respond, El Mouse did not say anything and continued to collect data. However, Sillen, that guy is cheating. Huimao suddenly shouted. Its round eyes stared straight at El Mouse, full of anger. El Mouse spread his hands helplessly. How am I cheating? Although he knew that Huimao could speak, El Mouse was still shocked by the cat's sudden voice. Even Sillen and Joaquin, who were in the middle of a conversation, were looking at emus with the same expression. Kid, you're trying to play tricks right under our noses? You want to keep Carreño company, right? El Mouse wanted to say something, but Huimao raised its paw and pointed at El Mouse. He's shaving Huimao did not know how to describe it. Sampling, Sillen said tacitly. Yes, sampling. There's an additional fee for sampling. El Mouse's face froze. How could he collect information more accurately without sampling? Sillen looked at El Mouse and calmly took out the receipt. Name your price. Joaquin and El Mouse. El Mouse wanted to say, I'm not collecting any more. But I've already signed 10 million. Wouldn't it be a waste to give up on me? Therefore, El Mouse signed another $1,000,000. You don't have to pull a long face. I know you can report the debt to the higher-ups, it's not like you need to cut your own flesh, Sillen said while looking at Emu's bitter expression. Then, he handed over 2 bills. Looking at the numbers on the 2 receipts, El Mouse's eyes darkened. He pointed at Sillen with a trembling hand. You don't go too far. Carreño's bones are not worth that much. 10,000,000 was written on each of the 2 receipts. When did I say that these 2 receipts were related to Carreño? Sillen looked at El Mouse. You've collected those 2 worms, haven't you? El Mouse froze. He did not expect Sillen to know about it. He had secretly collected samples of the 2 worms, and Joaquin had not noticed it. However, according to El Mouse's evaluation of the 2 worms, 10,000,000 for each was considered cheap. Therefore, Joaquin watched as El Mouse signed 2 more 10,000,000 receipts. Joaquin roared in his heart. Vanguard Division 6 has produced a genius. 5 hours later, a starship of the 6th Division arrived at the outskirts of the planet. Led by Schotten himself, they had tracked down the delayed signal Huimao had left behind. Although the delayed signal would be delayed, it had the advantage of concealment and could evade Poison Fang's signal detection. On the way here, they encountered the spaceplane carrying the unconscious Akai and the others. Other than 3 who were still in the ICU, the rest were in normal sick rooms. This allowed Schotten to breathe a sigh of relief. Originally, they hadn't placed much hope in Sillen. Carrie, Xiao Shang and the others were even prepared to fight with everything they had, but they didn't expect the result to be like this. When they arrived at the planet, they saw the debris floating in outer space. When the people at the crossfield fell one after another, some people on the starships that had stopped outside tried to escape. Therefore, Carreño pressed the controller in his hand. There was a button on the controller that controlled the bombs installed on the starship. The people of Poison Fang only had 2 choices. They could either die in battle or be blown to pieces. Carrie and the others stared blankly at the debris outside the planet. At the same time, the signal receiver converted the received signals into information and displayed it on the big screen. Sillen did not allow them to enter the planet. He only ordered them to send out an unmanned spaceplane, and forbade anyone from the 6th Division from approaching the planet. Although Schotten did not quite understand Sillen's words, he did as he was told. After the spaceplane returned, Carrie gave Sillen a heavy punch when he saw that Sillen was fine. He had been holding a grudge against Sillen's solo operation this time. You're not allowed to do something like this next time. Call us if you're going to do something. Yeah, me and Ba Dao too, Xiao Shang said while patting Sillen's shoulder. Hey, who's that guy? Carrie pointed at the meeting room door next to him with his chin. When Carrie saw the stranger who boarded the ship at the same time as Sillen and Joaquin, he was about to go up and take a look. However, Schotten had dragged everyone into the meeting room for a secret discussion and didn't give Carrie the chance to inquire. That's the enemy of my enemy. Sillen did not say Imau's name because the name Imau's was definitely a fake. As for what Imau's real name was in the military, Imau's probably wouldn't tell him. The people of the 6th Division did not know what method Sillen had used to completely wipe out Poison Fang, but one thing was for sure. They were starting to feel a sense of fear towards Sillen. Be it the normal personnel or the lieutenant commanders, everyone was obviously careful when they spoke in front of Sillen. Sillen had made a great contribution this time. He had saved the hostages, seized back the energy ores, and even destroyed Poison Fang. Even the A squad of Vanguard probably wouldn't have been able to accomplish such a feat with such efficiency. At the same time, Sillen also told Akai, Joaquin, and the others that without Huimao, he could only destroy Poison Fang but not the hostages. Therefore, it was all thanks to Huimao that Akai, Joaquin, and the others were able to survive. As a result, Huimao's status rose once more. Every time Joaquin and Akai saw Huimao, they would smile kindly. This also led to Huimao being pampered to the heavens, and his status in the 6th Division was even higher than that of a lieutenant commander. Schotten did not ask too much about Silen's actions on the planet. When Silen said that the planet would be listed as a forbidden zone for the next 100 years, Schotten agreed without hesitation. He ordered the people of the 6th Division to not step foot on the planet for the next 100 years, and also informed Bart and Songba Leruo not to enter. Wachin and Emaus did not object to the planet being listed as a forbidden zone in the slightest. They knew that the reason the insects did not attack them must be because of Silen. If Silen did not leave any medicine or other preventive items on them, they would have turned into a pile of bones a long time ago. After the group returned to the 6th Division's main ship, Diaz called for Silen before he could even rest. "You want me to be the lieutenant commander?" Silen glared at the smiling Diaz who was lying on the sickbed. The guy's complexion looked much better now. "No way." Silen shook his head and prepared to leave. He had overworked his brain and was so tired that he was going to shit himself. However, the door was firmly shut. He tried the door lock, but it was useless. Silen turned around to look at the one-armed Diaz. "What's wrong, uncle? Are you planning to force yourself on me?" Chapter 130. "I wouldn't dare in front of you." Diaz made an innocent expression. "At most, it's like forcing a duck onto a perch." "Then I'm really sorry, but I'm not a duck. Please find another duck." "Sigh, you know my arm." Diaz looked lonely, but he was interrupted by Silen before he could finish. "Acting pitiful is useless." "Ahem," Diaz straightened his expression. "I've discussed with Asha. After we leave Sector Z this time, the 6 Squad's injured members like me will head to Sector E together. You know, Sector E is most famous for its medicine, and our injured members go there to recover. It's just that we don't know how long it will take, so after some consideration, I've decided to let you take over the position of vice captain of our squad. If you don't like it, you can hold the position for now until I return. However, I may need a long time to recuperate." Diaz was injured like this because he was protecting Asha, but it was a blessing in disguise. His relationship with Asha progressed very quickly. Silen looked at the hopeful Diaz and said, "I'm going back to sleep." "Sigh, don't go. Actually, our squad usually doesn't have much to do. Beaver is the one who takes care of everything. That's why I, the vice captain, have always been relatively idle compared to the others. It's just that I'm wearing the hat of a vice captain, and I'll only show up when there's something important. That's why I'm pretty idle." Diaz talked endlessly about the benefits of being a vice captain to Silen. If Silen didn't want to manage too many things, then so be it. In the past, Diaz didn't really manage things anyway, so he was a lot more at ease with Silen. Moreover, no one would object to Silen becoming a vice captain. In the end, Silen agreed. He had his own considerations. Just now, Diaz said that a vice captain's rank had higher authority to know certain information and come into contact with certain things. In other words, he would have a greater chance of finding out about the Yuki Fujihara family. Silen had no doubt that the Gen family was at a very high level. If one didn't reach that level, perhaps they wouldn't even be able to touch the surface of the Gen family. At the very least, there was no relevant information at this stage. After leaving the room, Silen touched the tattoo on his thumb. Jenya's coffin was still inside. When would he be able to send Jenya back to the Gen family? Meanwhile, in Yudi and Beaver's ward, they were out of danger. They just needed to rest for a while. Moreover, with their gene levels, their recovery speed would be much faster. At this moment, Carrie, Xiao Shang, and Tang Qiuqiu were all gathered in the ward. After being depressed for such a long time, everyone was finally in a much better mood. Tang Kukikiu, who had been silent for a few days, finally began to speak. Yudi and the Miantuan were playing a puzzle game on the microcomputer while talking to the others. Suddenly, the ward's door opened. There was no one outside, but when they looked down, they saw Hui Mao strutting in with his tail up and a proud look on his face. Looking at Yudi and Beaver who were lying on the bed, Huimao said without any conscience. You guys are so weak. You actually got beaten up like this. Everyone. Don't compare us to you and that monster master of yours. Although Silen didn't talk about the situation on that planet, from the images taken from outer space, the situation on that planet was really terrible. They really didn't expect Silen to have such a trick up his sleeve. As soon as the Miantuan saw Huimao, he jumped up and ran toward him. It looked like he wanted to bond with Huimao, but in fact, he wanted to divert his attention because he was about to lose the game. After eating a candy that Tang Kukikia handed to him, Huimao walked around in front of everyone, feeling like a leader inspecting them. Then, he nodded in satisfaction. They were all in good spirits. Wheeze, why did the vice-captain call Silen over? Carrie asked. Huimao jumped onto a high shelf and looked down at everyone. He said proudly, Dias is leaving for treatment, and Silen is taking over as vice-captain. Don't worry. Since I'm your vice-captain, you don't have to be afraid if anything happens in the future. I'll cover for you. Is Silen the vice-captain or Master Cat the vice-captain? His attitude was like a cat with the title of vice-captain on his head. Everyone had expected that Dias was leaving for Sector E to get his arm treated. They were a little surprised that Silen was taking over as vice-captain, but they didn't object to it. Carrie and the others who were familiar with him aside, even the other members of the 6th Division wouldn't object to it. After the Poison Fong incident, Silen's prestige was very high. Yudi smiled, that's good. Master Cat will take care of them from now on. His words were sincere. Everyone knew what Huimao was capable of. He had saved Carrie, Akai and the others before, so they might need Huimao's help when the time came. The next day, during the 6th Division's main ship conference room attended by Bart and Songba Leruo, Shoten announced that Silen would be taking over Dias as the vice-captain of the 6th Division and the person in charge of the original 6th Division team. The Asha team had also appointed a new person in charge, Zaya Chasha. She would take over Asha's position as vice-captain. As for Asha, she was accompanying Dias to Sector E to get his arm repaired. After the meeting was over, Bart purposely patted Silen's shoulder twice heavily. Good boy. Not bad. We'll be waiting for you at the A Squadron. Songba Leruo did not object to Bart's words. It was obvious that he approved of Silen's decision. Based on Silen's performance this time, he absolutely had the strength to enter the A Squadron. However, they did not recommend Silen to the A Squadron immediately. Instead, they decided to wait and see for a while. Moreover, the 6th Division had gone to great lengths to find a talent like this. It would not be good to poach him away just like that. If Silen was fine while he was still the vice-captain, then Bart and Songba Leruo were prepared to promote Silen to the A Squadron straightaway. Receiving the approval of two famous A Squadron figures, Bart and Songba Leruo, Silen's status in the 6th Division had imperceptibly risen yet again. The weapons they developed based on the energy ores were officially put to use as well. This undoubtedly boosted the 6th Division's confidence. After a period of recuperation and reorganization, the 6th Division embarked on their return journey. They had completed their mission this time, collected enough information on the planets, found special energy ores, and destroyed Poison Fong's secret base in Sector Z. These achievements were enough for them to stand out in the Vanguard squad. Moreover, they had only used half of the originally scheduled 5 years. Bart also told them that the A Squadron was prepared to allocate a huge sum of money to the 6th Division as a reward for the 6th Division's achievements this time. This way, the 6th Division would have more funds to develop themselves. At the outskirts of Sector Z, there was a very wide rock belt. More than 20 starships were parked there, and Navigator and Heaven's Birthsby squadrons were among them. The reason they were parked here was because there was only one passage in this rock belt, and only one fleet could enter at a time. Otherwise, problems would easily arise if more than one fleet entered at a time. So, looking at the current situation, there was a problem. At first, there were a few hunter regiments arguing, and no one was willing to give way to the other. All of them were saying the same thing: "Why should I let you go first?" But not long after, AB Squadron from Heaven's Birth and AB Squadron from Navigator arrived almost at the same time. Therefore, the rest of the hunter regiments shut up and happily watched the 2B squadrons of the four great powers squabble. Chapter 131. There were a few relatively safe entrances and exits at the edge of Sector Z. While it was possible to enter Sector Z from non-safe zones with better security, it was much more dangerous. Poison Fang had entered through these dangerous zones. They were not afraid of taking risks. Bart, Songba Leruo and the others had also entered through non-safe zones. Unlike Poison Fang, they had higher technology and the ability to withstand risk. However, under normal circumstances, the B squadrons under the other hunter regiments and the four great hunter regiments basically entered through the safe passageway. There was a section of rock belt at the entrance of every relatively safe zone, and there was only one official passageway in each rock belt. The rock belt beyond the range of this passageway would greatly affect starships and spaceplanes, so normally only one fleet was allowed to pass through. In reality, the League of Stars could have opened this passageway wider, but it was limited to this size for ease of management. There was a planet at the periphery of Sector Z. It was where the League of Stars' army was stationed, and they could supervise the area around the rock belt. Who would have thought that today would be such a coincidence that all these hunter regiments had chosen this entrance, and all of them had come at this time? The League of Stars garrison on the planet was happy to see the conflict between the hunter regiments around the rock belt. It would be best if these hunter regiments could fight each other to the death, and the garrison could find them accordingly. When many hunter regiments ran into each other, they liked to show their insignia. Therefore, the hunter regiment's insignia flashed above the giant starships around the rock belt, as if they were afraid that others wouldn't know where they came from. After Navigator and Heaven's Birth starships had arrived, the other hunter regiments were obviously weaker. The two insignia alone were enough to scare away some hunter regiments. As expected of the Great Four, even their B squadrons were enough to intimidate others. Navigator and Heaven's Birth's B squadron's starships blocked the passageway, and neither would give way to the other. They couldn't put down their pride in front of this many hunter regiments, and if they allowed the other to enter first, then it wouldn't take long before rumors spread throughout the entire galaxy. If that happened, not only would they lose their position in the hunter regiment, they would also lose face as a whole. The two B squadrons each blocked half of the passage. If they tried to force their way through, they would definitely crash into those rock belt. On the planet where the garrison was located, the people in the surveillance room looked at the image displayed on the screen and laughed gloatingly. Suddenly, one of the surveillance personnel reported, "Sir, there's a fleet on the other side of the rock belt requesting to pass." "Oh? Which department?" The officer raised his eyebrows and asked. "It's a squadron of Vanguard." The officer smiled. He didn't think that 3 of the 4 great B squadrons would be gathered here today. The officer then said, "Send them a message. Tell them that the exit here has been blocked by Navigator and Heaven's Birth, so there's no way to get through." Alright. The monitoring personnel were also looking forward to the result of the three-way collision. At the same time, the Navigators and Heaven's Birth B squadrons blocking the entrance of the passage received news that Vanguard Division 6 was about to pass through, and they were hoping that they could make way for them. Both Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadron captains were amused when they heard this. "Vanguard Division 6? Who do you think you are? Coming out? Fine, think of a way yourself. I'm not moving anyway. Let's see what you can do about it." Not long after the communication ended, all the hunter regiments and the surveillance room on the garrison planet noticed that a fleet was coming from the other side of the passage. They really dare. Their first thought was that the other side had gone mad. Their second thought was that this was going to be a good show. At this time, all the hunter regiments had received the signal from the other side. It was a signal unique to Vanguard's B squadrons, and under normal circumstances, hunter regiments would make a corresponding retreat when they received such a signal. However, the current situation was that all the hunter regiments other than the four great ones had retreated to the side, and only Navigator and Heaven's Birth were fighting vanguard. 1 against 2? Interesting. No matter which side won, it would be a rare show for them. The signal displayed on the screen indicated that the two sides of the passage were getting closer and closer. The Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons had already given their orders, and their military systems were ready. If they really wanted to fight, they wouldn't mind opening fire right here. Moreover, there were 2 B squadrons from 2 of the 4 great ones on this side of the passage. Vanguard's 1v2 had to look at their opponents first, right? In many people's opinion, Vanguard Division 6 had acted recklessly this time. To put it bluntly, they had no idea what was good for them. However, this opinion was soon overturned. Just when Navigator and Heaven's Birth were about to open fire, the other side suddenly deviated from their flight path. This meant that the other side wasn't inside this passage, but they showed no signs of slowing down at all. What on earth are they trying to do? There was a flash of white light, and a composite starship covered in a layer of dark red energy shield charged out. Moreover, it was charging right above the Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons. The rock that had been blocking the front of the composite starship was frozen by the white light, and then turned into dust when the black-red energy shield crashed into it. The black-red energy shield of the composite starship looked even stranger and more mysterious in this atmosphere. As the starship flew out, it left behind some stone fragments that had been frozen by the cold beams of light. The light reflected by these frozen fragments was incomparably gorgeous against the dark background. When the starships flew out, in the signals received by the various starships and the monitoring rooms of the garrisons, 6 consecutive sounds that sounded like accented cannons appeared in a specific rhythm, one louder than the other, interspersed with the music of beads. The data and pictures displayed on the electronic screens of some of the starships that were not heavily guarded were all jumping in the same rhythm. The hunters who heard the music felt as if their hearts were beating in sync with the music. The music slowly turned ancient and distant, like a sharp knife that pierced through every space. Above the starship, a huge saber-like cursor appeared. Although it was only a cursor, it was so sharp that everyone had the illusion that it was even more imposing than before. There was a number 6 next to the sharp knife. Vanguard Division 6. Although they didn't attack the Navigator and Heaven's Birth B squadrons, Vanguard's 6th Division had flown out of their heads. Moreover, they were wearing the distinctive dagger insignia of Vanguard when they flew out. A slap in the face. This was a slap in the face under the watchful eyes of the public. The 4 great hunter regiments had been at loggerheads all this time. There wasn't much open fighting, but there was a lot of covert fighting. Just like this time, the two sides didn't exchange fire at all, but the result was much more intense. After the composite starship flew out, it didn't communicate with anyone. There was only the fading sound of music and the weakening signal as the starship flew further and further away. It was like a king on a journey, leaving only a glimpse of his silhouette and the feeling of being looked up to in that instant. Chapter 132. What would the hunter regiments think? What would the 2B squadrons from Navigator and Heaven's Birth think? What would the garrison at Sector Z analyze? Vanguard's 6th B squadron couldn't be bothered to care about those things. The main reason Schotten chose such a forceful approach was because of Bart's words, "Be forceful when you should be." Songba Leruo's evaluation of Schotten was that he was overly cautious and lacked dominance. If he did not change, then the 6th Division could only linger around the same spot no matter how great their gains were. In order to lead the 6th team further, Schotten chose a more forceful approach this time. After all, the newly developed weapon had given him a lot of confidence. 2.5 years later, the 6th team exited Sector Z. Maybe it was because Sector Z was a little traumatized, but it felt like everywhere was heaven after they left. Sector Z was filled with irregular magnetic fields, constant ion storms, high radiation, and strange creatures. They had to be careful almost everywhere they went, so they felt like their breathing was a lot smoother after they left Sector Z. Although the news of the elimination of Skeleton King and Caranio was not widely publicized, everyone in the circle knew about it. The 4 great hunter regiments, the military, and some major forces all knew about it. However, not many people knew that Silen was the one who actually destroyed Poison Fang's base. This was Silen's own idea. He did not want to be too ostentatious, so it was better if the name Silen appeared less often. After all, this name could stir up too many people's sensitive nerves, and those people were not easy to pacify once they were stirred. After they left Sector K, the extra time in the 5-year plan was given to everyone as usual. Some people would return to their hometowns to rest for a while before meeting up with the fleet, and some would follow the fleet to Sector K. Sector K was the gathering place of the 4 great hunter regiments. It was the only sector dominated by hunter regiments in the League of Stars, and it was practically heaven for hunters. This was also one of the reasons why Silen decided to go to Sector K before he joined Vanguard Division 6. Every time a 5-year mission was completed, the B squadrons would return to Sector K. They would come into contact with the A squadrons, report their results, and hand over certain things. In the past, every time they went to Sector K and came into contact with the A squadron and other B squadrons, the 6th squad couldn't even straighten their backs, and they almost felt like they were invisible characters. But this time, they were emboldened. Even Barths and Songba Leruo had praised the 6th squad, so the other people's opinions were more or less the same. Therefore, the 6th squad's return to Sector K this time was a little excited even as they remembered the dead. Other than the energy blocks, Shotten had also returned with the Skeleton King, Caranio's remains, and some emblems made from Poison Fang's bones. Caranio could be considered an overlord, so his death would have a certain impact. It was best to leave Caranio's death to the A Squadron. After the A Squadron dealt with him, they would also erase some secrets they did not want others to know. This was also what Silen hoped for. Emaus would be brought to the A Squadron at Sector K. There, Shotten and the A Squadron would negotiate with the military. The military would have to pay a price to redeem Emaus, and the outcome was basically up to the A Squadron. As for the remaining Poison Fang members at Sector V, it was also a good opportunity for the military to win the hearts of the people. The military would not be too stingy if they could learn more about Poison Fang. Of course, this was also a great contribution from the 6th Division. Shotten still had to ask the A Squadron for the promised development funds. Silen had been sleeping ever since the meeting. He had overused his brain, and his brain had been calculating at high speed during the incident with Poison Fang. He hadn't really rested at all, so Silen only woke up after the fleet left Sector Z. Shotten asked Silen about his plans, and Silen thinks for a moment. Although he was now carrying the burden of a lieutenant commander, he still had 2 years of rest, and there was basically nothing to do. There was still plenty of time, so Silen decided to return to Sector X and take a look. He would walk around every sector, and no one would know that he was the one who eliminated Poison Fang and killed Caranio anyway. It would be a good distraction to look around. When the time came, he would meet up with everyone at Sector K. Shotten did not object to Silen's idea. He told Silen some information about Vanguard's communication with the Hunter Regiment and told Silen to be careful, contact him if he had any difficulties, and that Vanguard would support him from behind. This was the benefit of joining a Hunter Regiment. At the very least, he would have a big hand supporting him from behind. Carey was preparing to return to Sector K and meet up with his friends from the other B squadrons. Ba Dao was going back for a while. Xiao Shang was going with the fleet since his birthplace was Sector K in the first place. Yudi and Beaver needed to recuperate, so they stayed on the starship and moved with the main force. Diaz had brought the wounded to Sector E for treatment, and they would see a whole person the next time they met. However, Tang Qiuqiu was prepared to follow Silin. She felt that she would be happier following Silin. After the decision was made, Silin greeted Shotten and informed the rest of the squad. Then, he took Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao and piloted a small spaceplane to Sector X's transit planet when the starship passed by Sector X. After the spaceport's identity verification and danger inspection, the spaceplane landed on Planet X C-100. Planet X C-100 was an important transportation hub and transit station for Sector X. It had a special port for private spaceplanes and private planes to stop at, and it could also be used to help watch over things. Silin parked the spaceplane at an empty spot, went through the procedures and paid the corresponding fee. Then, he went out to forage for food with Tang Qiuqiu and Hui Mao. When Tang Qiuqiu heard that Silin had met Diaz here, she strongly requested to go to the restaurant near the airport. After 3 years, she came to this restaurant again. It was still the same, and it was still served by a robot and a waitress together. However, the waitress was no longer the one in her memories, and Silin himself was no longer the same as before. Silin told Tang Qiuqiu about the time he met Diaz all those years ago, and Tang Qiuqiu giggled so hard that she didn't even bother to wipe the ice cream stuck to her nose. Hui Mao, on the other hand, didn't have much interest in the past at all. Instead, it stared at the flying cars flying everywhere outside the transparent window, its round eyes filled with interest. It thought to itself how interesting it would be if it could take a picture of those flying cars one by one. Silin didn't plan to fly a spaceplane over. It was inconvenient to go through too many procedures. After eating his fill, he took a stroll around the area and then boarded the flight to Planet X C-362. Pets were not allowed on a passenger plane, and if you really wanted to bring a pet along, you must put it in a specific cabin on the plane. Hui Mao was an exception, however. It could stay in a corner of the plane and roll around without anyone noticing. When he saw that familiar planet and the satellite arrays around it again, Silin felt a different feeling in his heart. It had been 3 years, and he was back. Chapter 133. Planet X C-362, Planet Brown Earth. It was still the same as it was 3 years ago. Nothing had changed, but after seeing the prosperity of the 10 trade zones, even the most upscale district of Planet Brown Earth paled in comparison. Luxuriously dressed, pretentious upscale people could be seen everywhere on the streets, walking with arrogant eyes, as usual. Guarding an inch of land and living their own lives was a joy to them. Pretty good. At least most of them were self-satisfied and happy with what they had. Old Devon had opened a small shop in the city, and had also hired people from the slums to help. He was living a good life now. Having a son in his old age, old Devon always had a smile on his face. At least when Silin saw him, old Devon was always smiling happily. Tang Qiuqiu held a large cup of ice cream in one hand and a lollipop in the other. She ate happily, occasionally looking around curiously. Hui Mao was clamoring to take a flying car. He had originally planned to take a train, but at Hui Mao's request, Silin took a flying car instead. He hailed a taxi, gave the destination, and the flying car rose into the air and flew away. Silin did not allow Hui Mao to talk nonsense outside, so Hui Mao expressed all of his emotions through his round eyes. He stared unblinkingly at the flying cars in front and behind the taxi, and could not help but move his claws. There was no other way, his claws itched and he wanted to pat them. Silin looked at the scenery outside the taxi window. This planet was still the same. If it was in the 10 trade zones, there would probably be a lot of changes every year. The development of lagging sectors was much slower. When Tang Qiuqiu finished the ice cream in her hand, they arrived at their destination. Although this was only the edge of the slums, they could clearly feel the great difference from the prosperous areas in front. "Brother Silin, is this your birthplace?" Tang Qiuqiu asked. In her heart there was no such thing as a hometown, only the concept of birthplace, and she had no feelings for this concept at all. "Yes. Scylla took a deep breath. The air was still a mixture of dust and decadence. Huimao squatted on Scylla's shoulder and snorted occasionally. It was obvious that Huimao despised this place. Especially since he had just come from the bustling city center, the contrast was even more obvious. He really didn't expect Scylla to be born in such a broken place. The poor houses were still the same and the garbage dump was still the same. However, there were fewer people and there were more abandoned houses. Walking along the familiar street, he came to the door of a bar. This was the bar that old David had given to Scylla. It was also the small shop that Scylla had worked in for many years. Before he left, he had sublet it to Erching, who used to live in the same slum. Scylla had checked the original savings card. For the past 3 years, Carrie would have an extra sum of money every year, and it was always on time. Although this amount of money was nothing to Scylla, it was enough to show Ercheng's character. Scylla was very satisfied. Ercheng's brother, De Cheng, used to live in the slums as well. However, De Cheng was ruthless and risked his life to work in a high-radiation area. Unexpectedly, his genotype evolved from rank F to rank E, and he officially stepped into the city. However, Ercheng didn't have the guts. He was satisfied as long as he could live peacefully. That was why when Scylla rented the bar to Ercheng, he was very happy. Now, it seemed that Ercheng had been living well for the past 3 years. Scylla was no longer the same as he was 3 years ago. No one could recognize him. The shop's business wasn't good, but it was passable. Scylla didn't stay at the bar for long. Instead, he went to Jenya's house. The AI robots had been taking care of the house, so it wasn't very dirty. The Fuji tree hadn't grown at all, and it looked exactly the same as it did 3 years ago. After looking around, Scylla contacted an intermediary and bought the abandoned houses. He sent the blueprints to them and asked them to build according to the blueprints. At the same time, Scylla transferred all the money to them and even paid a little more. The intermediary was very happy and promised that they would do a good job. Scylla used another identity to go through the relevant procedures. After obtaining the ownership of the houses, he left the rest of the matters to the intermediary. They would supervise the completion. Scylla had savings on hand, and they were all galactic credits, which could be exchanged for even more sector credit. He wouldn't mind even if he had to buy the entire slums. However, Scylla chose to let this slum town develop on its own. He didn't want to interrupt this town's pace. Scylla also learned some things. The reason why there were fewer people here was mainly because of the chain reaction brought about by a newly developed planet, Planet XC369, not far from Planet XC362. Planet XC369 was originally a planet that was much poorer than Planet Brown Saturn. It was much more backward, and this planet's habitability was only grade B. In other words, if one wanted to migrate to Planet XC369, they would need more facilities to support it. These facilities would cost a lot of money, and this was also the reason why no one had paid attention to this planet for so many years. However, 3 years ago, not long after Scylla left Planet Brown Saturn, Planet XC369 was inadvertently spotted by an investigator from the Phoeniers family, a famous family in the League of Stars. The investigator obtained the rights to develop and manage the planet, and thus the planet's fate changed from then on. It was named Little Garden. Little Garden was twice the size of Planet Brown Earth. Its development required a large amount of labor, and the one thing Sector X did not lack the least was cheap labor. Planet Brown Earth, which was relatively close to Little Garden, provided almost 1/5 of the total labor force. Of course, these labor forces were of higher quality, and even the lowest genotype was rank E. Since Planet Brown Earth had lost a large amount of labor force from the city center, it gave the people of the slums a chance. Some of the strong and healthy F-rank genotypes were able to find a job at the city center of Planet Brown Earth, and that was why the slum population was decreasing. In just a year's time, Planet XC369 which was originally in an almost primitive state, had changed greatly. It truly lived up to its name, becoming a beautiful and colorful garden. Right now, Little Garden had become famous in Sector X thanks to the Phoenix family's promotion. Moreover, it had become one of the more important tourist planets under the Phoenix family. Every day, people from all over the League of Stars would come to visit due to its fame. "Do you want to take a look at Little Garden?" Silin asked Tang Qiuqiu and Huimao, while holding a flyer for Little Garden. "Yes. Yes," they answered in unison, looking very expectant. The image on the flyer was too attractive. "Alright, then our next stop will be Little Garden. Let's take a look at the legendary Sea of Flowers." There was a direct flight to Little Garden on planet Brown Saturn, but Silin had already applied for a pet certificate for Huimao. The inspection station outside of Little Garden was under stricter management, and while it was possible to sneak past it, Huimao would still have to come out once he reached the planet. In order to prevent more problems from happening in the future, Silin decided to apply for a pet certificate without hesitation. However, the word pet caused Huimao to grit his teeth. He thought for a moment and decided to forget about it. He wouldn't stay in the designated pet cabin for too long anyway. He would arrive after a nap. Little Garden? That sounds pretty good. Chapter 134. Everyone knew that Little Garden wasn't small at all. It was twice the size of planet Brown Earth, but there was an endless stream of people coming and going on this planet every day. The entire Little Garden planet was practically filled with people. The Phoenix family's businesses were relatively strict in all aspects. The direct passenger plane stopped at the spaceport outside of Little Garden. Similar to Seven Lights University, the passengers had their identities checked at the spaceport before boarding a specialized carrier plane to enter the planet. Before they even entered the spaceport, the passengers on the passenger plane began to get excited. The colorful and dreamy planet could be seen from the cabin windows and display screens. It was truly fascinating. After the checks were done, Silin led Tang Kukikiu into the specialized carrier plane. As for Huimao, it continued to squat in the pet cabin of the carrier plane. The moment they landed and stepped out of the carrier plane, the fragrance of flowers assaulted their nostrils. It was rich but not cloying, but the moment they walked out of the port, the fragrance changed. It became simple, elegant, fresh and pleasant. The moment they stepped out of the carrier plane, the fragrance of flowers changed almost every few steps they took. There were all kinds of scents, and flower beds of all sizes and shapes could be seen everywhere. There were even some vine-like flowers hanging in the air. That was so suffocating. Huimao shook its fur, raised its butt and stretched its back before jumping onto Silin's shoulder. Its cat head twisted and turned continuously as it looked at the surrounding scenery in astonishment. On this planet, be it the buildings or the means of transportation, they were all in the shape of flowers or carved with flower patterns. They inherited the diversity of flowers and filled this planet with the dreamy colors of a fairy tale. Silin was going to rent a means of transportation, a flower car. This was an indispensable tool for the tourists who came here. It looked like a small carriage, except it was in the shape of a flower. There were tables and chairs inside, and the tourists could sit on it to eat, drink, chat, and admire the flowers. The speed, route, and so on could all be adjusted. It was very convenient. When they arrived at the flower car rental point, Silin looked at the display screen and asked Tang Kukikiu, "Which one do you want?" There were all kinds of flower cars on the screen, and it was dazzling. Tang Qiuqiu pursed her lips and looked at them for a long time. In the end, she chose the Lily of the Valley car. The flower car was like Lily of the Valley, white and bell-shaped. It was very cute. Since there were only 2 people and a cat, Silin chose a small flower car. After paying, a card popped up next to the machine. It was the proof of rental and the key to the flower car. At the same time, a 2-meter-tall Lily of the Valley car automatically drove out of the station. After scanning the card on the door of the flower car opened, and the fragrance of lily of the valley wafted out. After entering the float and setting up the control panel, 3 sofa chairs and a small round table popped out. The chairs were soft and looked like they were sitting on the petals of a lily of the valley. Silen had set up a short route. First, he had to go to a few nearby shops to buy some food and other necessities. Tang Kukikiu bought ice cream and candy, Huemao's codfish burger and fish biscuits of various flavors, and Silen also bought some food to fill their stomach. One had to admit that the service at the place managed by the Feniers family was pretty good. The quality of the food was also very good, and it wasn't too expensive. Silen even bought a palm-sized, flower-shaped camera for Tang Kukikiu to play with. The 2 people and the cat took a photo as a memento. The lily of the valley car floated on the passage. Silen had set the speed and route. Right now, all they had to do was sit in the car and eat, chat, and admire the scenery outside. 80% of Little Garden was a scenic area, which was enough for the tourists to see. There were intersecting floating passages in the scenic area. After the parade route was set, the float car would drive on these passages and bring the tourists to enjoy the scenery. Although they had felt that there were flowers everywhere before, it was only after entering the scenic area that they deeply felt like they had entered a sea of flowers. As far as the eye could see, there was an endless sea of flowers. Above the sea of flowers, there were some butterfly bees flying around. Butterfly bees looked a lot like butterflies. They had large, colorful wings, but lived like bees. They would collect nectar, but they wouldn't harm the garden like butterfly larvae. The manager of Little Garden had even specially built some beehives for them. All kinds of butterfly bees danced among the flowers, adding a lot of liveliness to the sea of flowers. The colorful world, the overwhelming scenery, and the refreshing fragrance of flowers all caused one to stop and linger in their tracks. The scenery at every stop was different. Even though the previous stop was already eye-catching enough, they didn't expect to see something else at the next stop. It was hard to comment. There was a monitor in the float car that would display the information of the area it passed, the types of flowers, the names of the scenic area, and so on, so that the tourists could better understand it. Rainbow Bridge. Big Brother Silen, let's go through Rainbow Bridge. Okay. Silen adjusted the route and the float car drove toward Rainbow Bridge. Tourists who came here would adjust their route to pass through Rainbow Bridge. Rainbow Bridge was an arched passage surrounded by flowers of 7 colors. From a distance, it looked like a rainbow. At the same time, there were some special suspension devices floating above and around Rainbow Bridge. They were all white like clouds, and water droplets sprayed from them, adding a bit of fun. The children passing by stretched their hands out of the window to catch the water droplet. Tang Qiuqiu was no exception. She could hear their laughter from afar. Tang Qiuqiu also carried Huimao out of the window and drenched him with water droplet. Huimao was also having fun. He shook his ears and shook his head, throwing water droplets on Tang Qiuqiu. He opened his mouth to drink water, and the water droplets that sprayed out had the sweetness of nectar. Wow, look, there's a cat! On a float car in front, a 4 or 5-year-old child poked his head out and smiled, pointing at Huimao who Tang Qiuqiu carried out of the window. The gray cat even waved its paw in the direction of the little fellow, causing the little fellow in front of it to become incredibly excited. The little fellow tossed a bag of fish fillets at the gray cat, and the gray cat caught it with its paw before smiling so widely that its eyes turned into crescents. After passing Rainbow Bridge, a huge figure appeared in the sea of flowers. Flower Goddess, a figure made entirely of flowers. The girl made of flowers looked very demure. White flowers formed the wings on her back, and a long skirt decorated with flowers of various colors. In this sea of flowers there was a feeling of strolling in a courtyard, very beautiful. Tang Qiuqiu was holding the camera and taking pictures. Silen poked her little face and said, "Qiuqiu, there's honey over there. Do you want to try it?" "Sugar?" Tang Qiuqiu's eyes lit up. She looked in the direction that Silen was pointing. Not far ahead, there was a small shop that sold honey and other nectar. Nectar and flower tea were all specialties of Little Garden. After all, in the League of Stars, it was very difficult to find a place that was better than here. In this kind of pure environment, the quality of the nectar in Little Garden was also very good. Needless to say, the honey they made was naturally very good. Looking at the information on the menu, Tang Qiuqiu bit her finger. It was really too difficult to choose. In the end, she temporarily chose 10 types of honey and would buy them when she encountered such a shop in the future. After buying the sweets, Silen decided to rest at a stop. There was a plaza here, and tourists could park their float cars here and walk out to get some fresh air. Tang Qiuqiu sat on a flower-shaped wooden stool and showed Silen the scenery that she had taken along the way. Just as she was talking, she was interrupted by a young and angry roar. Get lost! Chapter 135. This roar attracted the attention of all the tourists around them. They saw a flying car with a unique design hovering in the air. Below the flying car were a few bodyguard-like figures, as well as an old man dressed meticulously like an official surrounding a boy around 10 years old. The old man had a helpless look on his face, but he didn't look annoyed. Instead, his eyes were filled with love. Silen knew that people who could use a flying car in a place like this were definitely not ordinary tourists. After all, the management of this planet was rather strict. It seemed that this group of people had quite a background. Even if they weren't from the Fenier's family, they were at least closely related to the Fenier's family. The one who yelled, "Get lost!" just now was that young master. Just by looking at his attire, one could tell that he was definitely the young master of some family. Moreover, the way that little guy looked at the people around him with disdain and arrogance in his eyes made Silen think that he was pride. The little guy's face was filled with anger at the moment. One of the bodyguards moved a step to the side and was glared at by the little guy. The bodyguard had no choice but to retract his foot and stand still like a statue. This was clearly the temper of a young master. It did look a little unreasonable. You just told him to get lost just now, but you got glared at right after you moved a step. What are you trying to do? He didn't know what the surrounding tourists were thinking, but at least Tang Qiuqiu couldn't stand it. However, she couldn't be bothered. She nudged Huimao with her elbow and pointed at an image displayed on the camera. Ignore them. Let's continue watching. Wheeze, what do you think of this one? The image was taken by Silen when they were crossing the Rainbow Bridge. Tang Qiuqiu pushed Huimao out of the car window, and the scattered water droplets reflected a rainbow of colors. Huimao moved closer to the other side, and his entire head blocked the image. Obviously, he liked this image very much. You're blocking me. Move to the side a little. Tang Qiuqiu scratched the fur on Huimao's head with a smile. In fact, after the young master shouted just now, the surrounding people unconsciously became silent or only whispered to each other. Therefore, Tang Kukikia's voice, which was not suppressed at all, seemed a little abrupt. At the same time, it was obvious that Tang Kukikiu had completely ignored everyone else and was talking to Huimao. The young master glared at Tang Qiuqiu, but both Tang Qiuqiu and Huimao were staring at the camera and completely ignored his gaze. The young master was so angry that his face turned red. He had never met someone who ignored him like this. This was simply unforgivable. Bastard. Although it was only 2 words, these 2 words were sonorous and powerful. It was even more imposing than the previous scram. He really deserved to be the young master of a big family. The surrounding people sighed in their hearts. However, it was a pity for the little girl. These people didn't seem to be easy to deal with. Everyone looked at Tang Qiuqiu with sympathy. Silen had been observing the old man. Although it seemed that the bodyguards were looking at the young master, the real person in charge was the old man who looked like a butler. However, the good thing was that the old man didn't show any malice. Hearing the young master's rather imposing roar, Tang Qiuqiu raised her head and glanced at him. The meaning of that glance was obvious. Don't shout, don't disturb us from watching the video. Tang Qiuqiu's obviously disdainful glance made the young master's face turn from red to black. He was so angry that he almost jumped up. However, slowly, the child seemed to have thought of something and his anger slowly subsided. Instead, he had a strange and malicious smile. The old man next to him raised his eyebrows. He had a bad feeling. The little young master raised his chin high and put on the airs of a young master as he walked step by step towards Tang Qiuqiu. At the same time, following the little fellow's movements, the few bodyguards and the old man also followed closely beside him. Seeing that Tang Qiuqiu and Huimao still treated him as heir, the young master raised an arrogant smile and raised his finger to Tang Qiuqiu opposite him. He said to the old man next to him, "Don't you need bodyguards? She's the one." Tang Qiuqiu turned off the camera, took out a honey candy and put it in her mouth. She jumped off the wooden stool and took Silen's hand. "Let's go. We've rested well. Let's continue to enjoy the flowers." She didn't want to talk to this crazy young master. "Stop!" Following the boy's voice, a few bodyguards blocked the path in front of Silen and Tang Qiuqiu. Silen stopped Tang Qiuqiu from kicking him and looked at the old man. The old man gave him an apologetic look and stepped forward to introduce himself without losing decorum. "My name is Costella, and this is my family's young master. I wonder if I might have the honor of treating the two of you to afternoon tea?" Tang Qiuqiu looked at Silen. She knew that she couldn't speak carelessly in a situation like this. The other party was going to use force. Silen looked at the old man and said with a smile, "Then I'll have to trouble you." When Costella introduced himself just now, he deliberately revealed a symbol on his sleeve. It was the emblem of the Feniers family. Since the other party didn't make things ugly and offered a ladder for you to step down, wouldn't it be the same as forcing the other party to throw a tantrum if you didn't step down? Moreover, this planet was the Feniers family's territory to begin with. Even if they wanted to make trouble, they wouldn't go so far as to offend the local bully. Silen believed that the old man in front of him wouldn't go so far as to deal with them just because of this. Therefore, Silen agreed to Costella's suggestion. The little boy looked at Tang Qiuqiu smugly and beckoned for the flying car, which had stopped in the air, to descend. This flying car was very big, about the same size as a large flower car. However, the interior was much more luxurious. Silen and Tang Qiuqiu went inside and sat down. Huimao jumped into Tang Qiuqiu's arms and allowed Tang Qiuqiu to tickle it. The bodyguards took their seats at the back and front. There were only 4 people in the middle. Silen and Tang Qiuqiu sat opposite the young master and Costella. Tang Qiuqiu didn't give the person opposite her a friendly look. She merely looked at Huimao in her arms and scratched its chin. The flying car rose into the air and stopped after flying for a short distance. A small tea table popped up in the middle of the room. Costella picked up the teapot and poured 4 cups of tea. Costella was the first to state that this was a misunderstanding. He had no choice but to bring Silen and Tang Qiuqiu up here. After all, it wouldn't be good for their reputation if they continued to cause trouble down there. Secondly, Costella expressed that this young master's suggestion was also a misunderstanding. However, before he could finish speaking, the young master forcefully interrupted Costella's words. "I said, let her be a bodyguard. Didn't you say yesterday that you wanted to add more bodyguards? Just nice, let's use her." Tang Qiuqiu had a strange expression on her face. She moved closer to Silen's ear and whispered, "Big brother Xiao Shang once said that those who let a woman protect are all gigolos who live off women." Although Tang Qiuqiu's voice wasn't loud, Costella and the young master would definitely be able to hear her since they were so close. Tang Qiuqiu didn't intend to hide it from them in the first place. She was purposely letting the young master hear her. The old man didn't have much of a reaction, but the young master was infuriated. He slammed his palm on the tea table in front of him. "Who do you think you are? Letting you be my bodyguard is already an honor for you. How dare you mock me?" Humph, a brat who doesn't know anything. You're not even as tall as me, Shorty. Gigolo! Ugly freak. Scylla and the old man watched as their children slammed the table and glared at each other, arguing until spittle flew everywhere. Both of them remained calm and said nothing. Bang! Tang Qiuqiu slammed her fist on the table and gritted her teeth. She wanted nothing more than to send this annoying bastard flying with a kick. She used to do whatever she wanted in Sector V in the past, and there were plenty of times when she would be served with a gun at the slightest disagreement. But after joining the 6th Division, she had toned down a lot. Still, this guy in front of her really pissed her off. Tang Qiuqiu turned around and asked Scylla, "According to the rules, I can accept missions during my free time, right?" Scylla thinks for a moment. "Sure. All right." Tang Qiuqiu looked at the brat in front of her. "If the pay is good and it's within my free time, then I'll accept the mission to protect you, Gigolo." The young master looked at Tang Qiuqiu disdainfully. "How much pay can someone like you be worth? You overestimate yourself. I might as well hire someone from the Big Four." The Big Four referred to the 4 Great Hunter Regiment. Tang Qiuqiu paused for a moment. She seemed to be hesitating about something. Scylla took a sip of tea and said, "Go. I'll be at the back if anything happens." The corner of Tang Qiuqiu's lips curled when she heard Scylla's words. She fished out the item hanging around her neck and slapped it on the table. "I am Tang Qiuqiu, a member of the 6th Division of the vanguard of the Big Four Hunter Regiments. Gigolo young master, may I know the price of the Big Four's hunter rewards?" Chapter 136. Looking at the dagger-shaped emblem with a 6 on it that Tang Kukikiu had slapped on the table, even Costella was a little stunned, much less this young master. He couldn't tell that it was actually one of the Great Four. Naturally, Costella could tell whether the emblem was real or fake. That was why he was surprised that Vanguard actually had such a young hunter. Moreover, with Costella's knowledge, he could tell from the emblem that this little girl was a core member of the B Squadron. Vanguard Division 6. This is fake, right? The young master's face was red as he roared angrily, but it was obvious that his kidneys were lacking. Tang Kukikiu let out a humph and put the emblem back on her neck. She carried Huimao back onto her lap, scratched Huimao's chin and said, "Some people just can't take a loss, can they?" Huimao narrowed his eyes and gave face by meowing. The young master was so angry that he almost flipped the table. Costella straightened his expression. "My apologies. So you're Vanguard's hunters. I hope you won't blame me for my slight neglect just now." Actually, with Costella's identity, there was no need for him to be so polite to the hunters of 2B squadrons, even if they were members of one of the Great Four, Vanguard. However, the main reason Costella was acting this way was because of the 6 on Tang Kukikiu's emblem. Vanguard Division 6. He had recently received many secret reports regarding this B squadron, and according to his understanding, this B squadron had a strong momentum to rise. "Since you're hunters of Vanguard, then I need to reintroduce myself. This is my young master, Fenrir's Tobo, and I'm his servant. Welcome to Fenrir's little garden." Since Costella said that he would reintroduce himself, it meant that it was time for Scylla to introduce himself. Sir Scylla put down his teacup and took out his own emblem, Vice Commander of Vanguard Division 6, Scylla. "Sorry for the interruption." Costella's eyelids twitched. Vice Commander. This young man in front of him was actually the Vice Commander of Vanguard Division 6. Now, Costella really had to admit that he was blind. Such a young vice captain and such a young member were truly astonishing. The flying car left the scenic area and landed at a manor. This was the Fenrir's family's private lodging area. Tang Qiuqiu and Huimao were sitting in a reception room. The servants brought out all kinds of pastries. Tang Qiuqiu and Huimao ate happily, completely ignoring Tobo, who had a cold expression on his face. Scylla and Costella went to another meeting hall. Costella told Scylla about the mission this time, and at the same time, explained the relevant issues. The Fenier's family's young master, Tobo, was bored at home, and he just so happened to hear that a group of people from the family were heading to Sector X's little garden for supervision work. Therefore, he asked his parents to agree to accompany them to Little Garden to relax. Since the young master was going on a journey, it was only natural that the security work had to be done well. There were even a few corvettes, but not long after they arrived at Little Garden, they received a request for help from another of the family's properties in Sector X. Half of the bodyguards had gone over to support them, but the number of bodyguards was insufficient. The young master had also grown tired of playing here, and the personnel who were transferred away had not returned even when the original return time arrived. For the sake of Tobo's safety, Costella did not act according to Tobo's wishes. If they were to leave and return now, the accompanying bodyguards would be insufficient, and it would be easy for something to happen. As for the reason why Tobo was angry earlier, it was because he did not have the patience to stay here any longer. In a fit of pique, he took the float out to relax. In the end, he was still annoyed by the bodyguards around him, and that was why he started yelling at the resting plaza. "Do you think that there's something fishy going on here?" Celine asked. Indeed. Costella did not try to hide it either. You know that many children of big families have experienced being held hostage or kidnapped, let alone a big family like the Fenier's family. Those who have the guts to act are all strong, and they are not easy to deal with. Not to mention that they are hiding in the dark. Of course Celine, who had once worked with the heir of the Duance family, Aflon, understood the twists and turns in this matter. Otherwise, Aflon would not have asked Celine to pretend to be his son back then. As far as I know, a big family at the level of the Fenier's family would protect their young children very well. But why did they take the risk and agree to let little young Master Tobo come to Sector X from Sector F? The distance between Sector F and Sector X could be considered to be quite far. Even if something were to happen, distant waters would not be able to put out a nearby fire. Moreover, Tobo was still young. He was only 10 years old. He did not even have much ability to protect himself. Costella smiled proudly when he heard this. The Fenier's family places great importance on the safety of their children, but the process of growth is just as important. The people of the Fenier's family cannot be afraid of things, and they cannot give up just because there is danger. They need to train, and this age is also the best time to broaden their horizons. Celine nodded in agreement. It was true that if they were kept in a greenhouse, they would either grow up to be a prodigal or a man who lived off a woman. Take Lung, Ci Jincheng, Knight and the others for example. Which one of them did not have a deep background, but their individual strength was also extremely strong. This was inseparable from their own training. Giving might not necessarily bring about rewards, but wanting to reap rewards without giving was bullshit. "How long does the mission last?" Celine asked. "If those bodyguards still don't return after 3 days, we will immediately leave and return to Sector F. The mission will end when we arrive safely at Sector F." "All right, but I must make something clear first. Tang Qiuqiu is the only one who has accepted this mission. As for me, I have no choice. My own child needs to grow up, so I have to keep an eye on her." The reason Celine did not interfere with Tang Qiuqiu's actions was because he wanted to give Tang Qiuqiu some experience. As a hunter, she would accept free missions sooner or later. Since Celine did not participate in this mission directly, Costella only had to pay Tang Qiuqiu for the mission reward. The base reward was 1 million, and another 1 million would be paid after the mission was successful. Originally, Costella had only prepared a base reward of 500,000, but when he saw Tang Qiuqiu blow up a butterfly bee outside the manor with a raise of her hand after receiving a gun, he raised the price without hesitation. Costella sighed. As expected of someone from the vanguard, this girl's gun sense was just too good. She did not need to take time to aim. She fired the gun at the first moment she felt it. She did not even need to look at the result to know that she had hit the target. Food and lodging were included during the mission. For Tang Qiuqiu, who had accepted a free mission for the first time, this was indeed a huge sum of money. Tang Qiuqiu felt as if the road ahead was filled with honey. Although she was excited, she still had to read the agreement seriously. Diaz had said that she could not be careless with the agreement. If someone were to take advantage of a loophole, then she would not be able to do anything about it even if she cried when the time came. After she felt that there were no mistakes, she signed the agreement and officially began the mission. Tang Qiuqiu signed the mission agreement, while Silen signed a different agreement. He had to abide by some of the rules of not participating in the mission. At night, Silen lay on the bed while Hui Mao lay next to him. Because of the mission, Tang Qiuqiu slept in the room next to Tobo's bedroom. Silen, why did this coconut silk family or whatever let Qiuqiu be that young master's bodyguard? Wouldn't it be better to hire someone more capable? Hui Mao wagged his tail from time to time. A big family like the Fenier's family usually wouldn't hire a hunter as their bodyguard. They trust the people they nurture more, so that old fox Costella must have some reason that he didn't tell us. Still, no matter what, this is a pretty good growth experience for Qiuqiu, said Silen. That's true. Besides, Qiuqiu can get 2 million for this mission. She said she'll treat me to a fish feast when the time comes, hee. Go to sleep, foodie. You can even taste a fish feast in your dreams. Hui Mao snorted twice, curled his body into a ball, and hugged his head as he slept. In the middle of the night, Silen opened his palm and a few flying insects flew out. Silen looked at the direction they were flying in, and with a wave of his hand, he put them away again. Chapter 137. Although everyone knew that Tang Qiuqiu had become young Master Tobo's personal bodyguard, they treated it like a child throwing a tantrum. The fact that Silen and Tang Qiuqiu were part of Vanguard's 6th Division was only known by Costella and a few others. In the few days before he left Little Garden, the young master was still bored. Since he had a new bodyguard, he brought Tang Qiuqiu, the little bodyguard, out for a stroll. Silen and the other bodyguards followed them not far away. Sitting in the small flower car, Silen and Hui Mao were playing chess. Since Hui Mao had seen the Miantuan and Yudi playing chess before, he got excited and wanted to play a few rounds with Silen. It had to be said that since he was a cyborg, he had powerful computing abilities, so he was pretty good at chess. However, it was not enough to play chess with powerful computing abilities alone. In comparison, Silen's mind was more flexible than Hui Mao's, so Hui Mao was always in a passive state. Beep! Hui Mao lowered his head and stared at the chessboard for a long time before he shamelessly pressed the reset button. He lost again. Silen looked out the window and ignored Hui Mao, who was rolling on the table. Hui Mao rolled back and forth on the table, groaning for a long time. When he saw that Silen was ignoring him, he raised his paw and hooked Silen's sleeve. Ignored. Hooked again. Still ignored. Hui Mao was angry after a long time without any result. He even vented his resentment for losing the game. He leaped, jumped onto Silen's head, and started ruining his hairstyle. Silen raised his hand and flicked Hui Mao's head, then pointed outside the window. Look over there. Hui Mao spat out the hair in his mouth and looked in the direction Silen's finger was pointing. There were people in wedding dresses taking videos. There were often newlyweds coming from afar to take videos. There was nothing special about it. He had seen many of them since the first day. What's so good about taking wedding photos? Could it be that Silen wants to get married? If you want to get married, you have to find a rich, beautiful, fertile, and not a prodigal. That's what Carrie said. I'll ask him when I see him. Silen pulled Hui Mao's ear. You're so stupid. Who said that? What's that? The place you're talking about is the wedding photo shoot. The gray cat patted Silen's forehead in dissatisfaction. Let's test your eyesight. Silen pointed to the person who was taking pictures of the wedding dress. with the place where the bride is standing as the center and a radius of 100 meters. How many butterfly bees are there in this circular area? 169. Huimao answered almost immediately. Among them, 132 are carbon-based creatures and 37 are mechanical camouflage. After a pause, Huimao continued, among the 37 mechanical camouflage bees, 7 are monitoring the few people taking the wedding photo, 10 are monitoring the surroundings, including us, and 20 are facing the direction of Tang Kukikyu and young Master Tubu. With just a glance, Huimao could distinguish the butterfly bees that looked the same to others. Although the disguised mechanical butterfly bees were fine with the other butterfly bees beside them, in Huimao's eyes, there was a world of difference between carbon-based creatures and mechanical objects. He could tell with just a glance. There were no surveillance devices installed in the float. It seemed like the Fenier's family was very concerned about the privacy of their passengers, but in reality, they had other ways to monitor them. Not bad. Not bad. Sillin nodded. Of course. Look at who's doing it, Sillin interrupted Huimao's self-improvement. Then have you noticed which mechanical camouflage bees have microweapon systems? Huimao's ears twitched and he jumped from Sillin's head to the table. If one paid attention to Huimao's eyes, one would notice that his pupils were greatly dilated as he looked out the window. Call monitoring, communication monitoring, gene level analysis, laser scanning, high-density energy stimulation beam. Huimao listed a few of the systems on the camouflage butterfly bees. Meow, there's even a self-destruct mechanism. Huimao's beard moved as he looked at Sillin. I wouldn't have known if I didn't look. Other than the camouflage mechanical butterfly bees, there are also many mechanical camouflage bees in the flowers and underground soil. I just saw a mechanical camouflage earthworm and a few mechanical ants. Don't they have too many spies? Doesn't this mean that our every move is being monitored? That's true. The Fenier's family has a lot of protective surveillance, but it's not necessarily a bad thing for us. Sillin tugged at Huimao's beard. What did you see? That's right. Although there were mechanical camouflage bees everywhere monitoring everyone's every move, it was also a lot more convenient for Huimao. This was because he could see the surveillance feed of these camouflage bees without being discovered by the Fenier's family. Wo meow, they're actually kissing in public! Huimao yelled. In another float 50 meters away from the one Sillin was sitting on, a young couple was having sex. Originally, it couldn't be seen from the perspective of Sillin's float, but Huimao saw it through the surveillance feed of the camouflage butterfly bee. The young couple didn't think that anyone would notice their actions. Although they couldn't see anyone else from the window, their every move was still known by certain people. Yo, that girl's skirt has a slit. Seeing that Huimao was becoming more and more frivolous, Sillin slapped him. Look at how Qiuqiu and the others are doing. Qiuqiu is playing a game. That young Master Tubu is slamming the table. He looks very angry and is even yelling loudly, but Qiuqiu is ignoring him. In another float not far away, Costella and a person who looked like a bodyguard were sitting inside. Is everything ready? Costella asked with his eyes half closed. Everything is ready. However, according to the information we received, there might be some movement on the other side. Isn't this too risky? After all, the young master is following us. Costella sighed. There's no other way. This is the old man's wish. We can only do our best. If we don't run into the people on the other side and everything goes smoothly, of course that's a good thing. If we do run into them, we can only do our best to keep the young master away from danger. Please don't worry. We will definitely do our best to protect the young master. However, the people from Vanguard, you don't have to worry about that. I have my own plans. Under young Master Tobo's repeated urging, Costella finally ordered his subordinates to prepare to depart. This time, they were escorted by 3 corvettes on their return journey. Although it was not as impressive as when they had first arrived, it was still considered a large scale compared to the others. The 3 corvettes formed a triangle around the starship that Tobo was on. Scylla was also on this starship. However, in order to avoid arousing suspicion and to abide by certain terms of the agreement, Scylla and Tang Qiuqiu did not have much contact during this period of time. After all, Scylla did not directly accept this protection mission. Tang Qiuqiu continued to play with her game console every day. As for Tobo, because he lost to Tang Qiuqiu in a shooting competition, he had been practicing his marksmanship on the starship. However, no matter how much he practiced, Tang Qiuqiu only had one sentence to say: "Stupid as hell." She had completely copied Scylla's evaluation of Hui Mao and the tone of voice when she spoke. The 4 starships did not run into any accidents along the way. It was fairly peaceful, and their next destination was not Sector F. Instead, it was Sector H that they would pass through halfway. There was a Phoenier's family branch base there, and it was also the administrative center of the entire Sector H. Costello said that he had received orders to go there and would be delayed for 2 or 3 days. However, young Master Tobo did not lose his temper. In fact, he was quite happy. What was the most famous thing in Sector H? Seafood. Chapter 138. There weren't many habitable planets in Sector H, but most of the planets in this region were special. Almost all of the habitable planets had more than 50% seawater, and some of the planets with rank B habitability had seawater covering almost 100% of their surface area. That was why Sector H was also called the Blue Sector. When Scylla was strolling around Seven Lights Business District, he had seen a lot of marine products brought over from Sector H. He had to admit that Sector H's marine products were better than the other sectors. Therefore, there were many business groups or great families who would obtain the development and management rights of a certain planet after they had set their eyes on it. They would use it to breed marine products and so on. The Phoenier's family was one of them. Scylla flipped through the planet introductions on the electronic star map and saw a couple of familiar planets. For example, the one called Planet Aquamarine. That planet was Seven Lights' internship planet. However, Planet Aquamarine was a little far from the planet they were going to, so they probably wouldn't run into anyone from Seven Lights. The planet they were going to this time was Sector H's planet Zafia. This planet was the central management planet of the Phoenier's family's business in the entire Sector H. Zafia, Sapphire? Scylla had read Sector H's sector language before he came here, so he understood a little about it. Zafia meant sapphire in Sector H's sector language. The name alone was enough to tell how important this planet was. Unlike the other foreign starships, the 4 starships did not need to undergo safety checks at the spaceport. After they stopped at the spaceport and docked with the space station, a specialized spaceplane would escort Tobo and the others into the planet. At the same time, there were many escort spaceplanes and fighters that came out of the spaceport accompanying them. At the same time, their landing spot was different from the other foreign spaceplanes. They landed at a special landing spot, and there were already people waiting around the landing spot on the ground. Scylla was a little speechless as he looked at the formation around the spaceplanes. They needed to hire bodyguards for this kind of formation? But if they really needed bodyguards, then the ones who would be taking action would be their internal personnel. Otherwise, with the Phoenier's family's personality, how would outsiders even have the chance to approach them? Tobo, my dear little nephew, it's a pleasure to see you again. A dignified middle-aged man walked over with a kind smile and picked Tobo up. However, his beloved nephew didn't have a good expression on his face. He pushed away the stubbled mouth and said, "Second uncle, you haven't shaved yet." Kirk smiled and tossed Tobo into the air twice before putting him down. Tobo was obviously used to this kind of greeting, so he just kept silent with a long face. After putting Tobo down, Kirk nodded at Costello. "You've worked hard." Costello, on the other hand, was well-mannered. He bowed and said, "This is what I should do." The person Tobo called second uncle was called Phineas Kirk. He was the #1 administrator of planet Zaphia, and the CEO of the Phineas family in Sector H. Sillin had searched for some information regarding the Phineas family at Sector H before he came here. Phineas Kirk appeared quite frequently in some business magazines with high contribution points. Right now, Phineas Kirk wasn't as sharp as he appeared on the magazine. He looked a lot gentler, but this was only when he was facing Tobo and Costella. Kirk's gaze when he looked at other people might not be as sharp, but it was still imposing and intimidating. It gave people the feeling of stopping at the sight of him. As the CEO of a family's business management in a major sector, it could be seen just how important Kirk's position in the Phineas family was. However, even this CEO of a major sector did not put on any airs in front of Costella. In fact, he was mostly respectful. This was something that Sillin could see very clearly. It seemed that Costella's position in the Phineas family wasn't simple. Who's this little girl? Tobo, you're already flirting outside at such a young age. As expected of your father's son. Kirk winked at Tobo. Tobo's father was famous for his philandering ways before he got married. Tobo's face was red from holding back. Who would fall for an ugly freak with a bad temper? Of course not. She's very cute. I think she's much prettier than some families' little princess. She also has my favorite blue eyes. As for her bad temper, that was even more out of the question. Who would have a worse temper than a young master like you? However, Kirk did not say this out loud. If he did, Tobo would definitely explode on the spot. However, when Kirk looked at Tang Kukikyu playfully, this CEO of a major sector couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. When Kirk looked over, Tang Kukikyu also looked at him. However, what surprised Kirk was that Tang Chiochio's gaze was too emotionless. It didn't look like something a girl of her age should have at all. Normally, a girl of her age would be shy, angry, and awkward after hearing Kirk's teasing, wouldn't she? Although Kirk did not feel any killing intent from Tang Chiochio, he felt that if the environment was different and the scene was different, this little girl might just pull out a gun and shoot him with an expressionless face. A sense of uneasiness that shouldn't appear on a little girl of her age caused Kirk's eyes to flash for a moment. He straightened his body and swept his surroundings once. Kirk's gaze paused on Sillin for a moment before he withdrew his gaze. During this process, Kirk and Costella had exchanged a brief look with each other. They didn't need to say much to know what the other wanted to express with just a look, and it also meant that the two were very familiar with each other. Sillin's first feeling was that Kirk wasn't their target, and that he wasn't the one who was going to attack Tobo. His second feeling was that the person who was going to attack Tobo was definitely on this planet. Then, as the Phineas family's headquarters in Sector H, who was the person who would choose to attack here? But Huimao wasn't in the mood to pay attention to these things. After he exited the spaceplane, he kept taking deep breaths. There was the smell of the sea in the air, and there was also the smell of fish within it. This was truly a heavenly place. Kirk brought Tobo and the others to his private residence. It was also a large manor, and although it wasn't as colorful as the manor in Little Garden, it was still a refreshing sight to behold. There were all kinds of colors ranging from light blue to dark blue, and there were even conchas embedded in some places. When the wind blew, they would let out soft humming sounds of different tones. There were also wind chimes made from all kinds of shells that tinkled crisply and added a hint of liveliness to the atmosphere. Due to the unique layout, the entire manor was filled with the smell of the sea. After walking into the manor, Sillin discovered that there were guests visiting the manor since a long time ago. 2 children, a boy and a girl, who looked to be around 8 or 9 years old, skipped over and said, "Tobo, you're finally here. We've been waiting for you for a few days." It looked like these 2 children were old acquaintances of Tobo, and Tobo's face that had been sullen all this time finally smiled. "Why are you guys here?" Tobo ran over to the 2 children and huddled together. When Sillin passed by the 2 children, An indecipherable look flashed across his eyes. Before he entered the house, he looked at Costella, who was walking in front of him, and Costella just so happened to turn his head to look at him. After making eye contact with Silen, Costella lowered his eyelids, turned around and continued walking forward. So that's how it is. Now Silen finally understood why the Fenrir's family, who had never hired a hunter as their personal bodyguard, would hire Tang Kukikyu as Tobo's personal bodyguard. However, right now, Silen's confidence in Tang Kukikyu had grown a little more. After all, it was much easier to get used to a game she had already played. Chapter 139. The manor was located next to the sea, and one could see the sea view when they opened the windows. However, for those who came to Sector H, they preferred to be close to the sea and not watch from afar. The people who had arrived before Silen and the others were the Fenrir's family's partners in Sector H, the Binger family. Although the Binger family's influence in the entire GL could not be compared to the Fenrir's family, their influence in Sector H could not be underestimated. The Binger family originated from Sector H, and long before the Fenrir's family had expanded their influence in Sector H, the Binger family was already a big shot in Sector H. The two families had worked together for hundreds of years, and their relationship could be said to be close. It was worth mentioning that Kirk's wife was from the Binger family. The two children were the children of Kirk's wife's brother. In other words, they were Kirk's nephew and niece. Moreover, the two children were about the same age as Tobo, and they often played together, so their relationship was much better. The boy was called Binger Rost, and he was a year younger than Tobo. The girl was called Binger Emma, and she was the same age as Rost. They were twin siblings, and the whose little princess Kirk mentioned earlier was none other than Binger Emma. Right now, the three children were playing at the beach and building a sand castle. Emma had even picked up a lot of beautiful little seashells to decorate it. Due to the manor, the coastal areas around it had been heavily guarded. Moreover, there were bodyguards following and protecting them on the beach, so there was usually no danger. The bodyguards on the beach opened up a sunshade pavilion for them, but the three little fellows did not appreciate the gesture. They put away the sunshade pavilion and threw it far away. If they were tired or thirsty, they could just call out, and their bodyguards would immediately bring them towels and juice. Not far away from the three little fellows, Tang Kukikyu opened up a sunshade pavilion and placed a deck chair on it. Then, she pulled out the sunshade pavilion's tray and placed a glass of iced fruit juice on it. She played games and drank juice at the same time, enjoying the peace and quiet. Emma and Rost glanced at Tang Kukikyu a couple of times and asked Tobo who that was. Tobo was too lazy to say much, and simply said that it was his bodyguard and that there was no need to pay attention to him. After hearing Tobo's evaluation, Emma and Rost felt disdain and disgust towards Tang Kukikyu. With their status, there were many people trying to please them every day. Their mother once said that those who tried to curry favor with them only cared about their family's wealth. They didn't really treat them well, so they naturally classified Tang Kukikyu as one of them. After all, with Tang Kukikyu's age, she didn't look like a regular bodyguard. She was more like a freeloader. As for Tang Kukikyu, as long as her eyes were not filled with killing intent, she could just ignore them. Not far away, Silen set up a sunshade pavilion and lay on a chair to read an ebook. Huimao had gone to the sea to look for food. There was nothing good in the coastal waters, so it had gone to the depths of the sea. Silen was not worried about it. He believed in the ability of that foodie. Vice Captain Silen. A voice rang out from the side. Silen turned his head to look. It was the person in charge of Tobo's security. His name was Steele, and he should be under Costella's command. Although Steele was the main person in charge of Tobo's security, he wasn't a serious person. He wasn't like the other bodyguards who always had a stiff face. Hearing Steele's words, Silen said, "What's the matter, Mr. Steele?" Steele spread out a chair and sat next to Silen. "Why don't you take on this security job? With your status as the vice captain of Vanguard Division 6, the pay is very high. I'm not interested. I might as well watch over my own children and play with them. Steele glanced at Tang Qiuqiu, who was playing a game, and smiled. Tang Qiuqiu is indeed the most special child of her age that I've ever seen. Steele had witnessed Tang Qiuqiu's marksmanship before, and Costella had also said that not everyone could possess that kind of gun sense. Even some experienced assassins might not necessarily be able to achieve that level of accuracy. Moreover, Costella had also told him that even though Tang Qiuqiu was only 10 years old, the number of people who had fallen at the muzzle of her gun was definitely not small. She was also a child around the age of 10. Looking at Tang Qiuqiu and then looking at the three brats who were piling up sand, the difference was really King huge. Sillin did not comment on Steele's words. He glanced at Emma and Rost, who were decorating the sand castle, and said, "I'm afraid your security job this time will be very difficult." A sharp glint flashed across Steele's eyes. "Vice Captain Sillin, what did you guess?" "Guess? Do you guys always guess when you're doing security?" Sillin put away his e-book and rested his head on his arm. He squinted at the sea in the distance. It was indeed blue. "What do you mean?" Steele's gaze bore into Sillin, as if he wanted to confirm if this young vice captain had really noticed something. "You want to know? Name a price." Steele's face twitched. Name a price? As expected of a hunter, seizing every opportunity to make a fortune. Seeing that Steele was silent, Sillin did not say anything either. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the sea breeze, looking so comfortable that he was about to fall asleep. Finally, Steele could not hold it in any longer. "Did you notice something unusual? Your security job is pretty good, and you've chosen the right targets to monitor. However, I believe that you still haven't noticed something important," replied Sillin lazily with his eyes still closed. When Costella had lowered his eyelids back then, it was obvious that the other party would most likely use Emma and Rost to carry out the operation. However, Sillin was certain that Costella would never have thought of the other party's method. Steele and Sillin pondered. They had been keeping a close eye on the Binger family members who had come over this time. According to Costella's orders, Emma and Rost were the main focus. After all, Tobo was staying with them. Therefore, Steele had also been secretly monitoring the Binger family's bodyguards who were following Emma and Rost. If any of them made any strange movements, he would kill Wuxia. However, there had been no movements from the security team until now. Although Steele did not doubt Costella's judgment, they had indeed not received any strange movements from either party. Now that he heard Sillin say this, Steele's heart could no longer remain calm. After thinking for 2 seconds, he said, "The price is directly proportional to the importance of the content that Vice Captain Sillin has mentioned." Sillin opened his eyes and raised a finger. 10 million galactic credits. Steele. Could he beat up this guy in front of him? It doesn't matter. Take your time to think about it, but I won't wait until the deadline. Seeing that Sillin was about to fall asleep again, Steele gritted his teeth and said, "Fine." As soon as Steele said fine, Sillin took out a receipt from his pocket. It was obvious that he had prepared it beforehand. "Sign it." Looking at the sparkling numbers, Steele roared in his heart. Hunters and whatnot really deserved a beating. After putting the receipt away, Sillin did not waste any time. He took out the e-book in his hand and flipped through it before passing it to Steele. Steele took it. He was a little confused at first, but after all, he had been by Costella's side for so many years. His mind had expanded quite a bit. The more he looked at Steele, the worse his expression became. "I'll borrow the e-book for a while." He turned around and left after saying that. Sillin waved his hand. "Take it. The rent will be extra. 10,000 per hour." Steele staggered and squeezed out a word through his clenched teeth. "Fine." However, due to the urgency of the situation, Steele had to rush to report to Costella. Therefore, he did not hesitate in accepting Sillin's request. After Steele left, Huimao ran over from the other side of the sea. He shook off the water on his body and smacked his lips, looking very satisfied with his meal. Silen, there's a situation in the sea. Chapter 140. It was rare for this glutton's first words to not be about food. Something's up? Tell me. There were no other bodyguards around Silen's sunshade pavilion, nor were there any monitoring devices. Perhaps they knew that those little tricks were useless against Silen, so they did not install any monitoring devices around Silen. At the same time, Silen knew that this was Castella's way of expressing goodwill. Huimao stuffed his head into the cup on the tray beside him and drank some water. After pulling his head out, he shook his head and licked his paws to wipe his face. Then, he slowly jumped onto Silen's shoulder and lay down. There's an area where the dissolved oxygen in the seawater isn't normal, and it's been decreasing at an increasing rate while I've been foraging for food. There's something in the sea that's absorbing the dissolved oxygen. The decreased dissolved oxygen was not in the lake, but in the sea. It wasn't in the coastal area, but in the distant sea, and it was a large-scale change. There was no way the Fenier's family would not be aware of such a change, but there was still no movement. This meant that someone had tampered with it. The monitoring devices program or data set up in the sea had been tampered with, and the Fenier's family had not noticed this change. Only someone from the Fenier's family would be able to do this. Huimao continued, I've looked at those devices. The temperature, pressure, ion concentration, and so on are all normal. The only abnormality is the dissolved oxygen. If they changed too many items, the chances of being discovered would be higher. As long as they can fool the key items, they'll have achieved their goal. Huimao clenched his paws and continued speaking mysteriously to Silen. I went to the depths of the sea and found a few big guys. They're still sleeping, but it looks like they're about to wake up. Big guys. Silen sighed softly. Anything that could be called a big guy by Huimao would never disappoint. Somewhere in the manor, inside Kirk's private study, Castella and Kirk were sitting in front of a desk and having a conversation. Next to them was a light screen that displayed the location of the Binger family's visitors. Every single location was monitored in detail, but up until now, the reports from their subordinates had left the duo dissatisfied. It's too quiet. Kirk frowned. Yeah, it doesn't seem like their style. They aren't people who can endure. They shouldn't have waited until now. Castella placed both of his hands on his knees, his fingers moving rhythmically. In other words, they made a move, but we didn't notice it. Kirk did not object to Castella's opinion. That's why I feel uneasy. Why don't we call Tobo back to the manor? If something really happens and we can't react in time, Tobo will be in danger. Originally, he thought that letting Tobo go out to play would cause some commotion, but he didn't expect that there would be no results until now. All right then, as he spoke, Castella's communicator rang. This communicator would only be used by internal personnel in emergency situations. Castella and Kirk's hearts skipped a beat. They exchanged glances. Could there be movement? Connecting the call, the image of Steele appeared. Steele looked very anxious. What is it? Asked Castella. There's an important discovery. Let's talk in the study. After Steele entered the study, he handed the e-book to Castella. This is what Silen showed me. He said that the other party has already made a move. What was shown in Silen's e-book was a type of amphibious parasite. This type of parasite was a type of external fertilization. The female and male parasite would expel mature sex cells from their bodies. When the sperm and egg cells combined outside their bodies, a new life form would form and search for a nearby host. This kind of combination could happen in the air, on the ground, or even in the water. In other words, if Emma and Rost each carried a type of this parasite's sex cells, and these two people had injected some kind of medicine to prevent the parasite from forming a new life form in their bodies, then the one who would suffer the most would be Tobo. Being in close proximity for a long period of time was no doubt a great opportunity. Of course, the parasite on Emma and Ross's bodies would definitely not be the one that Celine showed them. The living environment of this parasite in the e-book was different from the climate and air humidity here. The reason why Celine showed this to Steele was to remind them where they should think about it. Otherwise, it would be too late by the time they realized it. Regarding parasite research, there was a period of peak 50 years ago, but it gradually cooled off after that. Nowadays, the most popular research was still on biochemical exotic beasts, viruses, and related medicines. Therefore, people nowadays wouldn't think about it from this angle. After all, it would be impossible to make good use of a parasite without a certain level of skill. However, Costello and Kirk did not expect the other party to possess such technology. They had miscalculated. While Costello and Kirk were reading the information in the e-book, Steele took out the bill written by Celine and told them about Celine's request. "If it's just money, we'll give it to him if he wants it." Costello retracted his gaze from the e-book and said in a low voice, "Yes." Steele paused for a moment and said in shame, "We lost track of the gray cat following Celine after it left the coastal waters." Costello was not too surprised by this. After all, there was no way a pet that stayed by the side of a lieutenant commander would be ordinary. He waved his hands and said, "It's not your fault. You go out first and wait outside." "All right." Steele bowed and left the study. After Steele left, Costello inhaled deeply and let out a long sigh. "Kirk, do you know how the big thorn in Sector V, Poison Fong, was eliminated?" Kirk shook his head. "I don't know." His main attention was still on Sector H, so he did not know much about the 13 backwater sectors. Therefore, he received the information relatively late. One of Poison Fong's strongholds, 100,000 people, was completely eliminated. The reason was parasites. Kirk could not help but inhale when he heard this. He suddenly felt a little cold. Poison Fong's people were infamous, but they were actually completely eliminated by parasite. The ones who eliminated Poison Fong were Vanguard's people. Since this matter was handled by Vanguard's A Squadron, not many people know the truth. It was common knowledge that information handled by the A Squadrons of the 4 great hunter regiments would be seriously distorted, and the truth would be blurred. This was also the capability of the 4 great hunter regiment. The one who eliminated Poison Fong was Vanguard Division 6, the squad Celine was in. Kirk understood now. He had thought that Costello's attitude towards Celine was a little strange. So this was the reason. "I know what to do now," Kirk said. Costello nodded. "I have a feeling that the parasites are about to reach the peak of their era after 50 years. Just as Kirk was about to give his subordinates an order, Costello's communicator rang. Looking at the display, Costello made a gesture to Kirk, and Kirk immediately put down the work in his hands. Costello had given Celine his communicator number on this planet. If there was nothing important or if the situation was not urgent, Celine would not call Costello's number directly. Just like how he had sent the news through Steele just now, although the parasite would affect Tobo, it was not life-threatening for the time being. But now, since Celine had called Costello's number directly, it meant that the situation was serious. Costello had no choice but to treat it with caution. The communication was connected, and Celine's image popped up. "I have a message." But Celine did not continue to say what it was specifically. "Name a price." This time, Costello did not need Celine to mention it. Chapter 141. This little old man was straightforward. Seeing how straightforward Costello was, Celine cut to the chase as well. 20 million galactic credits. Sure. Bill or savings card? Costello said this almost without hesitation. "There's no rush. I'll give you the bill. I believe that the Feniers family won't go back on their word when it comes to this. I'll tell you the information first." Celine straightened his expression. "There's a region in the ocean with abnormal dissolved oxygen." That was all Celine said, but he had already conveyed what he wanted to convey. He believed that with Costello and Kirk's intellect, they would be able to foresee and infer what might happen and certain threats. Since Sillen said that there was a region with abnormal dissolved oxygen in the ocean, and the Phoenier's family's monitoring device in the ocean did not detect this information, it meant that someone had made a move long ago. Moreover, Costella and Kirk were well aware of the disaster that could be caused by a large-scale abnormal dissolved oxygen in the ocean. Therefore, after hearing Sillen's words, Kirk and Costella immediately got to work. The three little fellows who were happily catching crabs on the beach were escorted back to the manor by the surrounding bodyguard. Before they left the beach, Sillen stopped Tang Qiuqiu and told her a few things. He also reminded Tang Qiuqiu to be careful. After that, Sillen and Huimao returned to the manor, where Costella had arranged a guest room for Sillen. Sillen passed the bill to Steele and asked him to pass it to Costella. This time, Steele did not look surprised. Instead, his attitude towards Sillen was a little more cautious than before, and his words were not as casual as before. After entering the room, Sillen placed his finger on Huimao's forehead. Huimao then transmitted all the information he had gathered in the ocean to Sillen. It was very strange. Sillen was clearly not a cyborg, but he could receive the information formed from the special signals sent by the cyborg Huimao. Feeling the information transmitted from his finger, Sillen also analyzed the situation here at the same time. He also saw the big guys in the deep sea that Huimao mentioned. If those big guys rushed to the coast at the same time, even if they had weapons, they would probably cause serious damage. What's more, there was an underwater base near the coast. If they were hit by those guys, the underwater base would be destroyed. However, Sillen was curious as to how those people could ensure that the big guys at the bottom of the sea would wake up and make them come over at the same time. While Sillen was analyzing the problem, Kirk welcomed a guest from the Binger family. Binger Warsaw, Emma and Rost's half-sister. Although she was a young lady, she played an important role in the Binger family's business. She also had the power to make decisions on some big issues. This also showed that this young lady wasn't simple. She had long hair that resembled the ocean, a dignified Rayleigh temperament, and a light blue dress that hung to the ground. However, as she walked, it outlined the silhouette of her long legs that were covered by the dress. She walked calmly towards Kirk and Costella. Unlike Emma and Rost, Warsaw's mother was a native of Sector H's ancient race, the New Europeans. Some people said that the New Europeans were the descendants of the mermaid. They possessed the appearance of humans and could walk and run on land. They could also transform into mermaids and swim in the sea. And Warsaw was undoubtedly more outstanding than her predecessors. The New Europeans didn't like to show their legs. This was because most people's first reaction when they saw the New Europeans was to look at their legs. This was because the New Europeans would transform their long legs into tails when they transformed. The New Europeans didn't like other people's gazes. Therefore, it had become a habit over time. They would wear long skirts or robes that covered the lower half of their bodies tightly. As for Binger Warsaw, the people of Sector H called her the Binger family's mermaid princess. This not only showed Warsaw's outstanding appearance and temperament, but also her background. What a surprise! I didn't expect the beautiful mermaid princess to come. Kirk gave a gentlemanly bow. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kirk. My father is ill and unable to come, but this matter is of great importance to him. That's why he sent me over. Warsaw also gave a lady's bow and responded appropriately. It looked like she encountered such things often. I'm very sorry that Emma and Rost have caused you trouble. Warsaw was referring to the fact that some people had used Emma and Rost to harm Tobo. Although the Binger family and the Phoenier's family would negotiate some matters here, no one from the Binger family had told Emma and Rost that Tobo was coming. In other words, some people had purposely leaked this information to Emma and Rost. With Emma and Rost's temperament, they would definitely cry and beg to come over if they heard that Tobo was coming to planet Zafia. Don't mind them. Even if they didn't use this method, they would have used other methods. Without the Fenier's family's permission, Emma and Rost would not have come over either. From a certain perspective, the Fenier's family and the Binger family had reached an agreement on this matter. After the small talk, Kirk told Warsaw about the matters here. Other than the parasite reproductive cells that Emma and Rost carried, he also told Warsaw about the matters in the sea. After all, Warsaw, who had inherited the bloodline of a European, would definitely know more about the problems of the sea. After Warsaw finished listening to Kirk's narration, the meaning in her ocean blue eyes was unclear. After thinking for a moment, she suddenly said, "Is it convenient for me to explore the sea?" "Go ahead." Kirk did not have any objections to Warsaw's request. He only hoped that Warsaw could discover more things and understand more. Only then would they be able to act more purposefully. Warsaw did not have time to meet Emma and Rost. Under the guidance of Kirk's men, she brought the Binger family members to an area of the sea on a spaceplane. Kirk had already dealt with the monitoring device in the sea and the related personnel. The fact that they had tampered with the monitoring device 7 days ago meant that these people had been deployed for a long time. Kirk was prepared to clean up every single person in the Fenier's family's territory in Sector H after this incident to prevent any future troubles. Warsaw changed into a new set of clothes and jumped into the sea with a few European newbies. After entering the sea, their arms and legs would change into webbing, tails, and fins. This greatly increased their swimming speed in the sea. At the same time, they could use their skin to absorb some of the dissolved oxygen in the sea. Before long, Warsaw returned to the spaceplane with her men and expressed that she wanted to check out the coastal waters. Although Kirk did not understand Warsaw's actions, he still agreed to it. Some people were not optimistic about this. Although Warsaw and the others were European newbies, the Fenier's family's defense system was also densely spread around the coastal waters. How could there possibly be any abnormalities? When the spaceplane arrived at the coastal waters, Warsaw jumped into the sea with her men just like before. Not long after, Warsaw returned with a pale face and told Kirk that they were in big trouble.